Tá, ótimo. E depois eu posso. Perfeito. Ah, perfeito. Ok. Então, se sobre isso vai apoiar. Problema técnica, então, para completar a perspectiva do diabo, figurações do espaço e da filosofia da Renascimento a Rosemary's Baby, o filme de Polanski, publicado em 2010. Foucault vai ao cinema, Bayard 2011. A filosofia que se fez, publicado em 2019. A Terra, o filósofo e o vírus, Bruno Latour, explicado pela atualidade, publicado em 2021, e em coautoria com Sylvia Lippi, Irmãs, para uma psicanálise feminista, em 2023. Então, o tema foi sugerido por Patrice Maniglier, ser saussuriano na filosofia, e convido, então, o professor Maniglier a assumir a palavra. Muito obrigado pela assistência e muito obrigado pela presença aqui conosco. Je vais começar. Je te laisse.
Hola. So I am going to speak in English. That's okay, because my Portuguese is in the future. If you have any problem with my English, maybe wait, I don't know, do something. Stay in total incomprehension of what I'm saying. And maybe if you prefer me to speak French, I can do that. But no, English is better than French. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Okay, so first I need to thank, and it's my great pleasure to do it, to thank Norman for Professor Norman, as we say here in Brazil. We say Professor Madarasz, but here you give the first name. So Professor Norman.
Professor Dr.
Dr. Norman. For having organized that, and also Gabriela Jaquet, who's been operator of my coming here in Porto Alegre. I was invited by the PUCI in São Paulo for a big conference, 2 days conference around the book. I don't know if about the book A Vida Enigmática dos Signos, O Nascimento do Structuralismo. So that has been recently translated in Portuguese. And I took the advantage of this conference to make a tour. So to Rio, I went to Manaus, and now Porto Alegre. And tomorrow I will fly back to Paris. So it's my last event, and I'm very moved and honored to be with you for that last event. It's a kind of bouquet final, say, because I have 4 very distinguished colleagues to speak with me about being Saussurian. And I also wish to thank Professor Nythamar and Professor Vitor for having accepted this invitation to discuss with me about what it could mean to introduce a Saussurian position in philosophy. Thank you very much again for making me this honor. And thank you, Norman and Gabriela, for having coordinated all that, accompanied me in a very, very, very kind way. So I was asked to give what Professor Norman called a position paper. So for me, position paper was like 15 minutes. In fact, it was all about being a Saussurian in philosophy. And it took the form of a manifesto. Being a Saussurian in philosophy is this, is this, is this. And then I realized that it was maybe too much. But we'll see. But I can start by saying that there are memes. Unfortunately, I didn't make a PowerPoint, but there are memes on the internet, you know, those little drawings about Saussure, a lot of them actually. There is even on X Twitter, unfortunate Twitter, when I used to use Twitter, which I don't do anymore. When Twitter was a respectable place, there was even a little group which was called post-structuralist memes, and they had very funny memes. And one very common one is, I used to be a structuralist, but now I'm not so sure. So there was a kind of paradox, right? And that so sure meant that, in fact, you don't want to be so sure, but in fact you are so sure. You're not so sure of being so sure, but in fact, in a way, that means that you are so sure, not being so sure. And so I don't have that problem because I am so sure of being so sure. Right? So at least of being a Saussurian, being on the side of Saussure, Saussurian. So, Saussuriano. It's a cogito. To be is to be a Saussuriano for me. So what does it mean to be a Saussurian in philosophy? Because I am a philosopher, and so one interpretation of my work is to introduce Saussure as a position in philosophy. So what does it mean to be a Saussurian in philosophy? Well, first, it means to have a philosophical identity that doesn't refer to a name, a great name of a philosopher in the legitimate canonic philosophical tradition. So I am a Saussurian, as some people are Hegelian, some people are Deleuzian. I could be a Deleuzian, but I prefer to say that I am a Saussurian, and that I think is even more true. It's truer. I am a Saussurian, even more than a Deleuzian. That is to say, for me, I am a Deleuziano. There's another meme that say, "Are you delusional?" Like delusional. So first, it means having a philosophical identity that doesn't refer to any given position within the philosophical canon. So it means being in philosophy from something outside of philosophy. And it means that if you are a Saussurian in philosophy, it means that you condition, using a word that our good friend Alain Badiou, Professor Norman and myself shared friendship and interest in Badiou. So it's what Badiou called the condition. The condition. You think that philosophy is conditioned by something that is not philosophical. In that case, it's part of linguistics. So being a Saussurian means that you condition your philosophical position by something that comes from outside of philosophy. That philosophy by its own means cannot really discover. It needs something else. It needs, in that particular case, a particular form of linguistics. So we philosophers, we are people who basically think. That's why we are so annoying. We are very annoying because we make a profession of something that is completely universal. Everybody thinks, as Althusser used to think. You know, everybody thinks, except that we try to think in a kind of technical way. So we make of something that is completely ordinary something that is specific. It's kind of expertise. That's why Auguste Comte, the founder of sociology, once said that philosophy, to be a philosopher, is to be a specialist in everything. In everything. And it means that we try to work on our intuitions. So we have intuitions about things. And to be a philosopher is to try to work and rework our intuitions. That is things that don't need any kind of particular knowledge to be said. That's what philosophy has always been about. A philosopher is always someone who is very ingeniously trying to capture something about reality by the power of the mind only. It's a very conscient definition of philosophy. And that I think is true. Philosophers speculate. That's what they do. They speculate about what is given. But because of that, they are at risk of missing very important things. In particular, when it comes to language, because language gives itself as a kind of ordinary perception. We hear sounds, and we have the impression that the question is then, how do we interpret the sounds that we hear? So for ordinary people, for normal people, particularly in modernity, and that includes philosophers, who simply just have intuitions. For ordinary people, language gives itself as phonic sensations to which is associated meaning, significance. And that, in fact, is wrong. That is wrong. It is not true that language is made of ordinary sound perception to which is associated meaning. Language is made of a specific kind of sound perception, which is unique to language, and in fact, not unique to language because it's true of everything that Saussure would call signs. But it's different from other kind of sound perceptions, particularly music. What is the difference? The difference is that in language, you don't hear the entire spectrum of the sounds. Very early on, even when you are in the womb of your mother, or at least of the person who bears the features, you lose the capacity of perceiving intermediary sounds. So if you are speaking in many Asian languages, for instance, don't make a difference that we in French make, and also in Portuguese, between, for instance, P and B, or R and L. So Paris and Bali are the same. You hear the difference. They don't even hear the difference. They don't perceive the difference. Just like in Spanish, you know, V and P are not perceived. In fact, in French, this is a very subtle aspect of French phonetics, probably that will not speak to you, but speak to me. It doesn't even speak to many French speakers. In French, there are two un, like you could say un beau brun ou un beau brun. Probably you don't hear the difference between un and un. So do you? In Portuguese?
No, not in Portuguese, but
Okay.
in French, yeah.
So the first one is written UN. The other one is written IN. Un and un. It's a super subtle difference. In fact, there is only one case in French where this difference is meaningful. Un beau brun and a beau brun. In one case, it means a very beautiful brown guy with brown hair. And in the other case, it means a very beautiful, where's the translation of un brin d'herbe? No, man, but in English, how do you say?
Leaf of grass.
Huh?
Leaf of grass.
It's not a leaf of grass, it's you know, in gazon, un brin d'herbe.
Grass.
It's a grass, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a leaf of grass.
A leaf of grass. Thinking.
Okay. It doesn't look like a leaf, it looks like a little green stick. Anyway,
A
so,
stem of grass.
voila. Prefer
But
that.
it's not a stem.
It's not a stem. So you see, we have a translation problem anyway. So it's better for you not to conflate, you know, a beautiful guy and a piece of grass. And but almost no French speaker hear the difference today. It's been lost because there's only one case in which it makes a difference. So the perception of language is called a categorical perception because we hear discontinuous sounds. We don't hear the continuity of the spectrum of sounds. In music, you hear all the intermediary sounds between two notes. You hear everything. That's why you could hear actually was not. But in language, you can't. So that is something you know only if you are like Saussure, super clever, and in fact, only if you study language from an empirical and scientific point of view. So you need to move aside from your intimate perception of language to realize that this perception is not a normal perception. If you just are within this perception, if you are a normal practical user of language, you don't care. You don't even realize that there is a difference here. And it so happens that the entire philosophical tradition didn't think of it, didn't realize it. The entire philosophical tradition, starting from Aristotle. How do you say Aristoteles in Portuguese? Aristoteles. Aristoteles said that, you know, language, it's the beginning of the logic of Aristotle. It's in the Organon. He said that, you know, language is made of sounds that are associated with internal emotions or affects. Mathemata. He doesn't realize that there is a problem with the perception itself. And that's the case for the entire philosophical perception. They think that language is interesting and is problematic because there is meaning. They don't realize that language is interesting and problematic because of the way it is perceived. And that is what it is to be a Saussurian in philosophy first, not first, second. Because first thing that is included in being a Saussurian in philosophy is conditioning philosophy with non-philosophical understanding of things. The second thing is realizing that the problem with language is not about meaning, it's about perceiving. It's not about understanding, it's about hearing or seeing. And what Saussure will say about signs, signus in general, is that you can call something a sign each time you have the same sort of problem, that is continuous basis of perception. So it could be visual, it could be auditive, it could be tactile, it could be smell, whatever. So are continuous, but in fact, the units of perception are perceived as discontinuous, immediately discontinuous. So it's not that you first perceive, if you do, I'm not sure, it's not that you first perceive what I'm saying and then you interpret it. That's the way we usually understand language. People say things that is produce empirical transformation of the world, and then another one tries to interpret that. Well, Saussure says, no, the only thing you need to know in order to share a language with someone is to share its sensitivity, to share the way people are sensitive to things, the discontinuities they are sensitive to in their world. So to have a common language is simply to share a kind of perception. Okay. So second thing, it's a kind of displacement of problem. To be a Saussurian in philosophy is to realize that the main problem of language is not meaning, it's perception. It's not meaning, it's sign. Once you've realized what constitutes a sign for someone else, you have everything to share the language of that person. Okay. So we are obsessed in philosophy with meaning. Actually, I have myself taught a class, a lecture at the University of Essex first, and then at Nanterre, which title was God, Death, and the Meaning of Life. You know, for philosophy, people think that philosophy is about the meaning of life, sens de la vie, meaning of life. But philosophy is more, if you are a Saussurian, philosophy is more about what makes sign for you, what is relevant as a sign for you, not what it means, but what in your life is significant, what bears, what is the element that bears the meaning, not what the meaning. And if you understand what people are sensitive to, what makes a difference for them, Saussure says, then you have everything. You don't need to wonder about what they understand. In fact, what they understand is included in the way they structure their perception. So meaning doesn't come in a second time. Meaning is part of the perception. Because the reason why we can, in fact, perceive discontinuities in sounds that are continuous is precisely because we associate differences of sound with differences of concepts, differences of signifiers with differences of signified. And the sign is constituted by, not by a particular thing, it's constituted by a correlation of differences. So to have one sign, you need at least two differences. And it's even worse than that. To have a difference in sound, you need at least to have two differences. For sound to make a difference, it needs to make two differences. That's what Saussure says. That's what it is to be a Saussurian, is to realize that there is a kind, at least a kind of difference that never comes alone. Okay, so to make a difference, you need to make two differences on two different levels at the same time. So you cannot reduce science, or you cannot reduce a large part of our reality to one unique empirical plane. You need to have at least two planes. And to be a Saussurian in philosophy is also to affirm that those two planes are not parallel to one another, are not homologous to one another. That is, the way the signs are related to one another from the point of view of the differences of the signifier are not the same as the way they are related to one another from the point of view of the signified. For instance, if I say bath and path, maybe actually my accent is not quite good here, but let's imagine it is. I'm not sure. There are probably versions of English where it should be very path and path. I'm not sure. But let's say we understand each other. Path and path. I don't know. We accept that. It's clear that they are very close. Those two signs are very close to one another from the point of view of the signifier. So there is a difference between P and P, okay, that makes a difference on the side of the signified. So to take a path and to take a bath is a very different thing. So if you say, I am going to take a path, it's not the same as I am going to take a bath. Okay, it will make different differences. It will make always a difference. The sign is a difference, but different differences. But the position of the word path in relation to other signs, from the point of view of the signifier is not the same as from the point of view of the signified, because path and bath, from the point of view of the signified, are very remote from one another. So you see, to be a Saussurian in philosophy is to realize not only that to make a difference, you need to make two differences, but that the map of reality that those differences make are not homologous. Okay, so you cannot reduce neither to a material empirical plane nor to a formal identity. You can never forget about the fact that there are two planes together. So Saussurian in philosophy is also saying that everything we care about is equivocal, has a multiple identity. Nothing can have just one identity. Everything is defined by its position with other similar things, but there are two maps competing with one another always at the same time. So no wonder we live in a mess, right? No wonder we live in a mess. Precisely, the reality is equivocal. The reality in which we live, which is the cultural reality, that is the reality made of science. It's always equivocal. That's why we can play on words. We can make jokes. We can make even very vulgar jokes, because we we use very close ideas in order to introduce a maximal difference, play on words. So to be a Saussurian in philosophy is to affirm that play on words are a key to understand the nature of science. We live in a chaotic world, but that chaotic world is not the consequence of the chaotic nature of reality, it's a creation of the human being. Okay, and then, so that's all about the primacy of the sign over meaning, and it's all about the ontology of the sign. Everything that I've been saying until now is a way of saying to be a Saussurian in philosophy is to realize that the sign is in fact a kind of being, but it's a strange kind of being. And from that, in fact, it's the entire philosophical tradition that is challenged. There is a question that the entire philosophical tradition has missed, has not seen. And to be a Saussurian in philosophy is also to affirm that signs are, that's a word by Saussure, but I think it's very important, signs are spiritual, but real. Or if you want, real, but spiritual. So signs, as I said, cannot be reduced to empirical sensations. So there is something spiritual, but they are real. That is, they cannot be only reduced to ideas that we have. Precisely, they have this equivocal nature, so they cannot be reduced to ideal formal entities. They are neither formal nor empirical. To be a Saussurian in philosophy is to oppose two dominant traditions in philosophy, both empiricism and rationalism. To be a Saussurian in philosophy is to affirm that there should be a third position, which is neither rationalist nor empiricist. So signs are not only made of sensations, but they cannot be completely separated from sensations. To be a Saussurian in philosophy means to affirm the qualitative nature of language. The language is not made of formal operations, as Chomsky said. The language is made of sensitive qualities. That's what I call qualitative linguistics. Signs are sensitive environments. They are not set of rules. So in the book, I devote the second part of the book, the entire second part of this thick book, so it's long effort, to say something against Saussure, against Chomsky, sorry. Which is precisely that, in fact, if it was possible to explain language with rules, then they would not need to be a Saussurian. It's because language is not reducible to rules. Language is not made of rules, it's made of signs, that is, of entities of particular kind, that we need Saussure. Saussure said something fantastic, mind-blowing, really, about what it means to speak, what it is to speak. To speak is actually to draw the other ones towards a particular position in our sensitive environment. So we share the capacity of making differences, and what it is to speak, that is, what I am doing now, is actually to try to use the differences you are sensitive to. I hope we share a bit of English. So I try to use the sense you have of the differences to draw you, to take you with me, so that you are going with me in a particular place within this sensitive environment that language is. And to understand one another is in fact to occupy the same position within language. So to speak is simply to indicate a position in language. A language, like French, Portuguese, whatever, is in fact a map. It's a map. But as I said, it's a strange map, because in fact, it's a map that is made of at least of two maps. In fact, there are a lot of maps. But all of them are made of positions which are overdetermined. It's as if you were in a metro, and each station belongs, in fact, to two networks of trains. See the problem? And you only have, the only thing you can do in that world is actually to give an appointment to someone in a particular station. But that station is always on two networks. So you are both in Paris and London at the same time. And it's the only way actually you can relate to people is to give the name of a station, but you know that the station is actually only made of a position, but also on two networks at least. In fact, there are much more than two. So this is what it means to be a Saussurian philosophy when it's about the nature of the sign. But there is something else. There is something else. It's also a theory of the mind or of spirit. As I've said, it's spiritual but real, or real but spiritual. So what Saussure also says is that language is a part of the mind, or probably the word mind is not correct here. Probably the Saussure has in mind the concept that is closer to the German word Geist. Geist. It's the idea of the Geist. So it's objective spirit. That is, there are spiritual entities which are not reducible to the representations that individual beings have. So there are spiritual entities that live by themselves, that go through our minds, but are not reducible to what you and I think at the moment that we share something. So they are independent from the subjects, the locutors. So they have a kind of reality, also in that sense. It's a reality of the mind. So the reality of the mind is made of signs and not made of ideas. So languages are not means or tools to communicate ideas. Languages are made of ideas. Signs are ideas in themselves, entirely spiritual, except that they are ideas that nobody is actually having. They are ideas that live by themselves, that reproduce by themselves. And that's why the title of the book is The Enigmatic Life of Sign. There is a life, they live. And yesterday, the invitation of the dear Professor Vitor, I tried to show that that is true of myth too. So if you want, the world of the mind is kind of, if you want, the fact that there are things that are spiritual should be explained by the ontology, by that is by the way they are. So spiritual entities or ideal entities, if you want, are not entities that exist in a particular kind of stuff. They are entities that exist in a particular kind of way. So there are ideas, but ideas are not made of a kind of immaterial substance. No, no, no. Ideas are made of a particular way of being. So it's just being as such, but it's being in a particular way. So it's that there is more than one way of being. It's a form of ontological pluralism. You cannot be a Saussurian philosophy if you're not an ontological pluralist. And it even says something very strong. It says to think is to be in relation with entities that are in a particular way. It's their way of being that makes them spiritual. It's not what they are made of. So it is true that, as Shakespeare said, we are made of such stuff as dreams are made of, but it's not stuff that is important. It's the way it is. It's a form of existence, not the substance of that existence. And to be a Saussurian philosophy is also to say that not only signs are, and that their being is a particular kind of being, but that they are also in such a way that they cannot but change. So, very famous line, at least I'm trying to make it very famous, by Saussure, who says French doesn't come from Latin, French is Latin. It means that it is by speaking Latin that we ended up speaking French. It's not that at one point in time, people changed their language. They never changed their language. To speak is always to repeat something that has been said in the past. To be a Saussurian philosophy is to think that things are repeated. There are things that only exist because they are repeated. That is, that repetition comes before origin. To be a Saussurian philosophy is to accept that there are things without origins. Derrida, in that sense, is a Saussurian. In other respect, is not enough Saussurian, but in that respect, he is a Saussurian. But it's also to realize that what is repeated here is such that the more you repeat it, the more likely you are to repeat something else than you thought you were repeating. So change is not an action that people make trying to do something else. Change is something that happened because of repetition. And again, that seems very trivial. You could say, well, yes, of course, the repetition in the end can make a difference, but it's not trivial if you remember that that thing only exists because it is repeated. It has it's not like one thing that then comes second time. It has never been the first time. Okay, it's always been in repetition. So how is it possible that something that only exists because it is re-identified has an identity that is such that it becomes a different thing? So the reason why Saussure, in fact, realized that signs were not empirical realities is because he was a comparatist or a comparativist. I'm not sure to say in proper English. He was an expert in comparative linguistics, and he was an expert in comparative cultural sciences, you could say, because he was also working on legends, on poetry, on even culture in Indo-European culture. And precisely that made him sensitive to the metamorphic nature of science. He knew that different languages were in fact the same. Portuguese and French are the same. That's actually why we understand one another. But in some cases, you can't even understand one another. Between Portuguese and French can work. But between Sanskrit and ancient German, it's harder. But in fact, they are the same. They are the same, but not the same. It's just like the object of love, according to the poet Verlaine. Ni tout à fait la même, ni tout à fait une autre. That's the person you love. Not exactly the same, not exactly another. That's the nature of the sign. It's one and multiple, the same and different at the same time. And what Saussure tries to do is actually to give a formal understanding of that entity. So it's not that it's not just a mystery, or it's not just an ununderstandable thing. It tries to understand the nature of that thing that can be at the same time, the same and different, one and multiple. So to be a Saussurian in philosophy is also to affirm that it's because the sign is irreducible either to material entities or to ideal entities, that it is also uncontrollable, that it varies always. So that is completely new for philosophy. In the tradition of philosophy, something that is not reducible to material entities, that is, something that is a bit ideal, is also invariant. That is what Plato said. A triangle, a pure triangle, is ideal. When you see a triangle on a wall, you recognize it as a triangle because you already have the idea of a triangle. And you cannot actually draw from all the different triangles you've perceived in the world the idea of a triangle, because the idea of a triangle is perfect. A straight line is something that nobody has ever perceived in the world. Okay, it's impossible to perceive a straight line, a perfectly straight line. And you wouldn't have the idea of a straight line if you didn't have the idea of a perfect straight line. That's what it means to be a straight line. It's perfectly straight line. But you have the idea. So Plato very strongly, very convincingly argued, well, it means that we can relate to things that are transcendent to our senses. And he was right. In fact, Saussure says, quite true, signs, ordinary signs, what you hear when you hear me, are all the same sort as triangles. That is, are not reducible to empirical perceptions, but they are perceived. But because of that, they also vary, which is not what Plato thought about triangles. Triangles are ideal because they are transcendent and invariant. Signs are ideal because they are, in fact, variable and immanent. That is, you cannot control them. You cannot put the identity of the sign over its variation. So to be a Saussurian in philosophy is to try to think about a kind of entity whose nature it is to vary. So that I call a Platonism of variation. It's another reference to our friend Alain Badiou. Alain Badiou spoke of a Platonism of multiplicity. It's the problem of a Platonism of the variant. So it's because something is not reducible to matter or to rational ideas that it is at the same time spiritual but variable. And there is one moment when Saussure, very rare, there is one moment when Saussure says that he has done something that is very important for philosophy. It's not in the course in general linguistics. It's in his manuscripts, in his notes that were discovered in the 1950s. And he says, the true problem of the sign is the problem of identity. I hope you understand that, given what I've said. But he said, what philosophers have never understood is what happens to identity when you introduce the factor of time, that is of change. And he says, if they had understood that, it would have changed everything. Because precisely, they would have realized that because we live in science, we end up thinking things that we never thought we would think, okay? That we never wanted to think. So signs are ideas, but ideas that change by themselves. And that means that in the end, we end up thinking, having perceptions, feeling things that are obvious, like even ethical rules, thinking that, for instance, same-sex couples should have the right to live just like people who are in other-sex couples, that kind of ideas. It's a consequence of the variation of the sign. We end up thinking that. It's obvious. Why it is obvious? Because it has a position in our symbolic system. The other people, it's not that they were nasty in the past. It's that they were not living in the same symbolic world. But in fact, it's because we lived in their symbolic world that in the end, we ended up thinking something differently. To be a Saussurian in philosophy is actually to think that thought is contingent, that everything is contingent. That is the result of history. So it's to renounce to the idea of foundation. That is very demanding. It's very demanding because it means that you cannot ground your life on any universal ideas. So we can affirm that we hold to things, to values, but those values are simply the expressions of our current symbolic system. So there is an ethics, Saussurian ethics, which is the affirmation of contingency. Good news, it means that there is nothing natural. So whatever there is could be different. The language in which we happen to be, or the culture in which we live, could be different. What does it mean? The notion of the arbitrary of the sign. It means that there is nothing in the nature of sounds or in the nature of human ideas that make it necessary for the existence of French. French is just the outcome of a history. It so happens that in the end, it is like that. but there is nothing in the nature of the substances on which French is constructed that make it necessary for that particular set of signs to exist. Given what we are, we could be in different sorts of sign systems. We are in that sign systems, it's because of a particular historical becoming. And so but the particular form of contingency, and that is also what's extraordinarily powerful for philosophy in Saussure, it's because language is contingent that it is necessary. That is, Saussure says everybody is happy with his own language. Nobody wants to change his or her own language. We would say, well, it's completely crazy. I always want to change my language. Think of the pronoun, the gender of the pronoun today. You know, in French, as in Portuguese, I suppose we have that problem. You know, we get she, he. We are embarrassed by the fact that we need to gender everything. That is, I am, and so you say, well, we are not content. We are not content because of a particular evolution of our own language. But it doesn't mean anything to think of a perfect language. Or you can think of a perfect language within your own language. Okay? So the sign is a being that is not preceded by its having to be. It is what it is. And it's at the same time contingent and necessary. I only know one thinker in the history of philosophy that has succeeded in mixing, conflating contingency and necessity. To this point, it is Spinoza. Saussure is very. What is contingent and necessary at the same time, because it doesn't mean anything to compare it to what it should have been. The very possibility of comparing it to what it should have been is a power of itself. It's power of the contingency itself. So that's maybe the most interesting aspect of Saussure. To be a Saussurean in philosophy is also to believe that everything is contingent. That is, again, it's the result of history, not evolution. So it's not a matter of evolution, it's a matter of event, acontecimento. So the language is an event, it happens. And everything in which we live is of that nature, it happens. So that is in too many words, I suppose. That is what it is to be a Saussurian in philosophy. And as you see, there are a lot of philosophical positions in Saussure. It's not just a matter of producing a linguistic theory. It's something that within or from linguistics changes a lot to the way we think. So it's another world. Of course, that world has a name. It could be called structuralism. And that is true. Saussure has to do with the nascimento do structuralismo. That's the subtitle of the book. It is true. Even though he never used the word structure, never imagined anything like structuralism, it is very true to say that he, in a way, is at the origin of structuralism. But to be a Saussurian in philosophy is also not being other forms of structuralist. To be a Saussurian in philosophy is not being a Jacobsonian in philosophy. It's not being a Benvenistian in philosophy. In fact, it's a way of being a structuralist in a demanding and transient way, which needs not to be conflated with other forms of structuralism. In fact, I am trying to defend the idea that there is a Saussurian tradition within structuralism. The most beautiful realization of Saussurian position is Lévi-Strauss. Lévi-Strauss, I try to argue in other places that Lévi-Strauss is more Saussurian than a Jacobsonian, even though he thought he was a Jacobsonian. That's a mistake of him. He is very much a Saussurian. Why? Because he thinks that symbolic systems obey to the notion of bricolage. Bricolage has to do with contingency. You do with it. You are immanent, right? So to be a Saussurian in philosophy is also to defend a particular form of structuralism against its misinterpretation, or possibly against its other variants. There are different forms of structuralism. So to be a Saussurian in philosophy is trying to be a structuralist hero of a particular kind. So, John Lennon, the Beatles, said, a working class hero is something to be, and that is certainly true. But a structuralist hero is also something to be. So to be a kind of hero. And that is what I'm trying to invite you to that movement, of that particular position within contemporary thought. It is something from the past, but it's also something that has never been realized, and I will conclude on that. To be a Saussurian in philosophy is also to name your philosophical identity by reference to an author that has no work, that has no oeuvre, no œuvre, no obra, I suppose. Saussure never wrote the book for which he is famous. And my position is that it's not because he was stupid, it's because there was something impossible in his ideas. Because precisely he thought, and he said it very clearly, that the only way you can put linguistics on the right direction is by shifting to philosophy for a moment and then coming back. So this relation to non-philosophical practices, to philosophical elaboration in order to go back to a better non-philosophical practice could be generalized. It could be true in arts, it could be true in politics, it could be true in sexual life, whatever. So to be a Saussurian philosophy is also to accept this shifting from non-philosophical to philosophical practices and back. Okay, but Saussure never finished his work. So it means that to be a Saussurian philosophy is also to accept that venture. That's why I'm saying it's a form of heroism. You might not end up with a work because you have a problem. The best thing you can do is sharing that problem. So to be a Saussurian philosophy is to do exactly what I'm trying to do here for the last 4 weeks. It's sharing my problem. And I hope that we will today see precisely the effects of that attempt with my distinguished colleagues and friends, and also maybe with you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Então, agora, muito obrigado, professor Maniglier, professor Patrice, professor Vitor. Agora vamos passar a palavra para a Gabriela Jaquet, que vai apresentar uma primeira série de observações sobre a fala de Patrice Maniglier.
So I will just do this very short presentation during the time Patrice Maniglier is organizing the file, but I will talk in Portuguese and also to establish the contact.
Oui, c'est bon, c'est ce qu'il faut.
Vou passar rapidamente pelo meu inglês. E, então, minha fala vai ser em português sobre a obra de Patrice Maniglier, e espero que também possa colaborar com as ideias de vocês. Quero agradecer muito a presença do meu professor, também foi meu orientador, de uma certa maneira. Quero agradecer ao Nythamar, professor Nythamar, desculpa, por essa, professora Jamir, por nos ter dado essa oportunidade de organizar esse evento, muito importante, muito bonito. Agradecer ao professor Noro, ao professor Vitor, que pôde também compartilhar comigo essa jornada que foi estabelecer esses eventos aqui do Patrice Maniglier em Porto Alegre. E agradecer muito a presença de vocês também. Então, a intervenção que proponho neste encontro tão especial que nos reúne hoje, que tem por fio condutor o título sugerido por Patrice Maniglier, Ser Saussuriano em Filosofia, consiste em uma discussão sobre a hipótese ontológica que percorre sua leitura do structuralismo. Minha abordagem será de tipo híbrido, procurando aliar comentário e problematização. Primeiramente, retomarei parte do argumento que ele expôs aqui e algumas das principais consequências dessa proposta, relacionando-as com as discussões que me inquietaram em minha própria pesquisa sobre estruturalismo e, mais especificamente, sobre estruturalismo em Michel Foucault. Em seguida, me apoiando nesse panorama, levantarei alguns questionamentos mais pontuais que visam estimular o debate e contribuir com a continuação deste reenquadramento filosófico do pensamento estruturalista. Reenquadramento filosófico que visa simultaneamente a criação de um novo pensamento. É precisamente este gesto teórico-prático que acredito ser uma das marcas mais importantes da proposta de Maniglier. A semelhança das diversas ressistematizações da tradição filosófica realizadas à sua época pelos próprios autores estruturalistas, tal abordagem, estando muito além de uma erudição exegética, procura bem antes compreender a própria explicação filosófica como uma atitude capaz de suscitar novos problemas. É assim que, a meu ver, podemos situar a divisão-chave entre estruturalismo dionisíaco e estruturalismo padrão, que atravessa grande parte de seus textos e que foi longamente desenvolvida no seu seminário permanente de História e de Filosofia do Estruturalismo, organizado junto de Jeanne Etalon e iniciado em 2022. Acompanhada do extenso quadro dos 10 critérios do desconhecimento do estruturalismo, que fazem eco àqueles para o seu reconhecimento expostos por Deleuze em 1967, esta divisão conduz, de fato, a uma reorganização da história da filosofia, cuja singularidade é a de transformar o diagnóstico que ela revela no espaço mesmo de sua nova atuação. A enquete filosófica conduzida a partir da linguística saussuriana pode, dessa forma, encontrar as pesquisas desenvolvidas por Maniglier no campo da antropologia, da ecologia, da psicanálise. A proposta que nos é apresentada se desenvolve através de uma articulação entre a questão da linguagem e o problema ontológico do real, a fim de caracterizar o estruturalismo não como uma outra teoria filosófica do sentido, mas como uma inédita percepção do ser, do signo. Aqui, a grande via das filosofias da significação funciona como um primeiro contraste e contexto dessa novidade. Emergindo a partir do século XVIII, essas filosofias, como expõe Maniglier em seu seminário, retomam a concepção tradicional da linguagem enquanto conjunto de signos que funciona como um instrumento para traduzir a realidade ou representar a existência. Ao mesmo tempo, elas respondem à ruptura causada pelo transcendental kantiano, que transforma a realidade em um objeto de acesso parcial, ao introduzirem o fenômeno da significação enquanto efeito da representação de tal realidade tornada, inacessível. Nesta configuração, o problema ontológico é, assim, ultrapassado pela relatividade epistemológica inaugurada por Kant. A realidade, por certo, não é mais uma construção relativa às categorias a priori do entendimento, mas será agora dependente do sentido que portam os sistemas de signos que percorrem uma organização social, cultural ou histórica. Por isso, grande parte dessas filosofias pós-kantianas podem ser consideradas, segundo Maniglier, como participando de uma abordagem construtivista da realidade. Sua perspectiva reúne, assim, de forma inquietante e certamente polêmica, a tradição hermenêutica, uma parte da tradição analítica, a tradição dialética, bem como as correntes pragmáticas e as vinculadas ao giro linguístico. Nestas últimas, nas quais o estruturalismo é frequentemente inserido, a linguagem ganha o status de um instrumento, mas um instrumento privilegiado, pois a realidade será vinculada às estruturas da língua e às múltiplas formas de expressão. A hipótese da ontologia do signo revela, então, a relação de intricação entre realidade e linguagem, percebendo nessa conexão a garantia de uma concepção realmente múltipla da existência. Tem um problema de computador. Tal configuração dispensa as filosofias em que a realidade é produto de uma construção e efeito do sentido, uma vez que a equivocidade do signo não permite tomar a linguagem como um instrumento de tradução, nem conceber o real como unicidade. Assentando a possibilidade desta operação na complexificação da compreensão científica da linguística, argumento-chave da vida enigmática dos signos, Esta ontologia se faz, de fato, uma condição essencial para superar grande parte das incompreensões que atravessam a história do estruturalismo. Ao evidenciar que a atitude estruturalista consiste em reconhecer a realidade equívoca da linguagem através do signo e em detectar essa mesma equivocidade nos objetos variados de suas próprias pesquisas, a apreensão ontológica enuncia o status da linguística que permanecia até então obscuro. O signo capta os diferentes modos de existência porque não se aplica como modelo científico às análises variadas, mas porque se repete na estrutura mesmo dessa realidade. Assim, finalmente é possível ver a ideia do ser da linguagem, tão cara a Foucault e tantos outros, se separar do esoterismo com o qual costumeiramente é tratado, para tornar-se a manifestação filosófica integral da nova concepção da existência que ela inaugura. E é dessa maneira que a proposição ontológica, vinculada à semiologia, possibilita igualmente que os objetos estudados pelo estruturalismo se emancipem de uma mera posição de particularidade contingente, subordinada a um domínio teórico que lhes estaria ao exterior, descobrindo a identidade relacional dos fatos analisados. Tal ontologia abala, dessa maneira, o paradigma da invariância na filosofia como critério para definir a genericidade do modo de ser dos objetos, reformulando a própria noção de teoria enquanto possibilidade de pensar filosoficamente a variabilidade. Ela contribui, assim, de forma decisiva para a compreensão de uma das características mais relevantes do estruturalismo, que é a de ter feito dos saberes positivos e das práticas diversas uma dimensão inerente ao discurso filosófico. Como sabemos, a orientação ontológica não foi uma caracterização privilegiada pelos autores estruturalistas para designar os seus próprios projetos. Podemos, então, dizer que a proposta de Maniglier se aproxima, nós veremos depois se o autor está de acordo, a uma leitura de tipo sintomal, na esteira saussuriana, identificando no estruturalismo o quadro de seu funcionamento latente, ela destaca o sistema aberto de seus argumentos, a partir do qual pode modificá-lo, colocando em cena uma configuração que, tal qual, não se faz nele originalmente presente. É assim que, a meu ver, o que indiquei como um reenquadramento filosófico se mostra na simultaneidade entre explicação e criação. A proposição ontológica justifica, através da demonstração, da importância filosófica que possuem antropologia, história, política, na reflexão estruturalista, ao mesmo tempo em que pratica tal entrelaçamento ao ter a possibilidade do seu próprio discurso atrelado à colaboração estreita com estes saberes. Tomando por eixo essa questão relativa ao status dos saberes positivos no estruturalismo, proponho, então, agora 2 pontos principais para nossa discussão. O primeiro concerne as condições de articulação entre ontologia e epistemologia no âmbito da análise estrutural e as possibilidades de compreender este diálogo enquanto cruzamento entre a tradição kantiana, que atravessa a maior parte dos projetos estruturalistas, e a problemática semiológica. A ideia é, então, refletir sobre a consequência ontológica da nova relação entre o empírico e o transcendental que o estruturalismo coloca em cena. Este transcendental, não sendo mais constituído pelo a priori do entendimento como em Kant, nem pelas estruturas históricas ou culturais como em Hegel, o será por condições de possibilidades múltiplas que retomam a própria relacionalidade ontológica do sistema. Trata-se, por exemplo, da posição que encontramos em Foucault, no contexto de sua crítica da antropologização da filosofia moderna, configuração que delineia o próprio espaço do estruturalismo em seu projeto. Contestando nas filosofias antropológicas uma confusão entre o empírico e o transcendental, que fez do homem, simultaneamente, conteúdo e condição de possibilidade, Foucault lhes opõe sua análise das positividades, a partir da qual ele parece reformular o projeto de uma filosofia transcendental, que respeitaria agora a separação do empírico ao situar o transcendental fora da subjetividade. De fato, para Foucault, como depreendemos sobretudo de suas afirmações sobre a relação entre a fenomenologia e o estruturalismo durante os anos 60, a singularidade do estruturalismo fora a de produzir uma nova organização das empiricidades, possibilitada pela ausência do sujeito enquanto elemento de fundação dos saberes positivos. Essa nova organização das empiricidades caracteriza o que ele detecta no estruturalismo, ele diz, né, pontualmente sobre a linguística Saussure e sobre Althusser, é exatamente o mesmo argumento, como uma lógica do real. A relacionalidade estrutural funciona como um novo regime de existência dos elementos, ao mesmo tempo em que o próprio sistema, composto por determinações científicas, históricas e sociais, opera como a condição de possibilidade desses elementos. Algo como a gente poderia caracterizar como um transcendental horizontal. Assim, é possível detectar nesta disposição uma preocupação epistemológica que se cruza com uma abordagem ontológica. É desta forma, por exemplo, em As Palavras e as Coisas, Foucault se refere às contraciências estruturalistas como domínios do saber cujas condições de possibilidade encontram-se em seus próprios objetos, exaltando simultaneamente na linguística seu poder ontológico de estruturação do real. Um outro exemplo é no discurso filosófico, tal configuração aparece com a noção de descrição, que em oposição à noção de fundação, faz as positividades garantirem-se a si mesmas nos circuitos discursivos, enquanto, a meu ver, a própria noção de discurso repete a mesma posição ontológica da linguagem que ele já afirmava anteriormente, né, no livro precedente aí de um ano, As Palavras e as Coisas. De fato, essa posição sobre o transcendental tem suas raízes na tradição da epistemologia histórica, na série de Brunswick, e encontra em Bachelard uma das suas contribuições mais marcantes. Ao contestar a universalidade e a totalização do transcendental kantiano e hegeliano, a história das ciências estabelece a possibilidade de um transcendental variável, constituído pela própria história do seu processo de surgimento e desenvolvimento. Decorre também, dali, a realidade fundamentalmente múltipla de seus objetos de análise, uma vez que estes encontram na rede de determinações do seu campo o único meio de determinar a sua identidade. Assim, a historicização do transcendental, ou o transcendental em movimento, como também foi caracterizado para a epistemologia histórica, encontra a questão do regime de existência dos seus objetos de forma semelhante àquela da ontologia do signo, da ontologia estruturalista. No livro La Philosophie qui se fait, livro de Maniglier, publicado em 2019, me dirijo a ele agora, você menciona várias vezes a importância de uma articulação entre as dimensões epistemológica e ontológica no estruturalismo. No texto Problem and Structure, Bachelard, Deleuze and Transdisciplinarity, também publicado no mesmo ano, você afirma a possibilidade de detectar na história das ciências, particularmente na vertente bachelardiana, uma ontologia ligada à noção de problema e de problemática. Gostaria de lhe perguntar, nesse sentido, como você situa a questão da retomada estruturalista da filosofia transcendental, especialmente no que se refere a um dos paradoxos que surgem do panorama aqui que eu tentei traçar rapidamente, né, nesse momento. Por um lado, o transcendental se renova, pois se formula agora com base em um sistema variável de positividades, o que, por sua vez, permitiu caracterizar o estruturalismo como uma operação, que a gente, né, vê frequentemente, de empiricização do transcendental. Por outro lado, o risco de um novo engajamento na lógica do transcendental seria cair em uma epistemologia da representação, reativando indiretamente a ideia de que o empírico permaneceria dependente ainda ou vinculado a uma função de fundação, o que lhe retiraria, mais uma vez, a possibilidade de uma existência plena. Donc, dans ce sens-là, c'est la phrase de la question. Voilà. Passo ao segundo ponto. Segundo ponto, então, que proponho para a nossa discussão, são dois. O segundo ponto aborda a relação entre essa ontologia estruturalista e os projetos ontológicos vinculados à fenomenologia, considerando suas respectivas articulações entre ser e ente, bem como as consequências dos processos de diferenciação que elas envolvem. A subordinação dos entes dos conhecimentos positivos à universalidade do ser do discurso filosófico caracteriza, como sabemos, uma das mais importantes críticas feitas pelo estruturalismo à fenomenologia. No que tange a Husserl, mesmo considerando as modificações que ele impõe à ontologia clássica, a sua ontologia formal se fundamenta, por certo, neste mesmo antagonismo entre ser e ente, posição que justifica sua ácida crítica às ciências empíricas. A mesma censura encontramos em Heidegger, mas também com a hermenêutica, a tentativa de estabelecer uma relação circular, não opositiva, entre o ser e os diferentes entes, conduzida pela diferença ontológica. Permitindo contornar o pressuposto husserliano de uma consciência instaurando os objetos, a diferença ontológica institui, então, o Dasein, enquanto existência que articula, através de sua finitude, a vinda dos entes ao ser. Posto que a diferença ontológica indica um processo irredutível entre ser e ente, potencialmente capaz de estabelecer com as positividades uma relação outra que de subordinação, poderia parecer em um primeiro momento viável engajá-la em uma relação afirmativa com a questão ontológica do estruturalismo. Seguindo uma reflexão que encontramos sobre o estruturalismo em meio fenomenológico contemporâneo, tal contato se daria a partir da temporalização originária, que, precedendo a diferença ontológica, se faria condição da estrutura ao suprir o que nela releva de uma pura enticidade, com a possibilidade do seu enraizamento no mundo. Pressupondo, no entanto, na própria estrutura uma separação entre o ôntico e o ontológico, subentendido nesse recorrente perigo positivista que é assinalado, a manutenção do âmbito da temporalização repete ainda uma forma de exterioridade, a mesma, por sinal, que Derrida apontava no início da gramatologia como um dos paradoxos do pensamento de Heidegger, em que os entes dos saberes positivos devem estar necessariamente, em um determinado momento deste processo, em suspensão em relação ao ser. Pensar o modo de ser dessas empiricidades como problema que lhes é imanente demanda, então, um outro deslocamento, e é assim que você indica, sobretudo no texto Manifesto por um Comparatismo Superior em Filosofia, uma distinção entre o projeto ontológico heideggeriano e o projeto semiológico estruturalista. O primeiro, compreendendo o ser a partir do nada, reengaja uma ideia unívoca da ontologia, enquanto o segundo, compreendendo o ser a partir do gesto comparatista, aborda enquanto multiplicidade. A ontologia comparatista não encontra, então, o problema do ser e do ente em dois tempos, a partir do que ela se perguntaria sobre sua legítima conformidade. Se ativando através da diferenciação das positividades e práticas, a comparação mostra que os entes, em sua essência, são indistinguíveis do regime de variação que coloca a sua existência. Como você defende no seu artigo Embaixada dos Signos, sobre Bruno Latour, ensaio de metafísica diplomática, isso permite não somente ultrapassar o impasse do ser enquanto referencial, mas também conduz à inclusão das mudanças que podem ocorrer no modo de ser de um mesmo ente ao longo de um determinado processo. Enfim, nesse sentido, gostaria de perguntar, no entanto, se enxergas o comment vous voyez, como enxergas alguma relação entre essas duas vias, principalmente no sentido em que ambas, ao se separarem da ideia da diferença como uma propriedade que se diz de algo, ou seja, ao pensarem a diferença independente de uma assignação e então como processo, podem compreendê-la como motor da própria existência. Ou seja, como distinguir sobre este aspecto, a diferença ontológica heideggeriana da diferença da ontologia diferencial comparatista, estruturalista. Tal significa, no fundo, e c'est toujours bien de vous entendre là-dessus, sempre é bom escutar esse aspecto, indagar se podemos ainda seguir Derrida quanto a uma convergência entre Heidegger e Saussure, junto de Nietzsche e Freud, na via inaugural do pensamento da diferença. Muito obrigada.
Agora, estou com dúvida. Você gostaria de reagir? Would you like to react to Gabriela's, or shall we?
I would like just to say a few
the
words.
floor? Sure.
But first
Okay.
to thank Gabriela.
Então, o professor Maniglier vai responder a Gabriela e depois abriremos por algumas perguntas antes de fazer uma pausa.
Yes, so I will first thank you, Gabriela, for your questions and also for your own work, because what Gabriela Jaquet has done in her PhD thesis is to show that Foucault is a structuralist hero. That was hard, because there are a lot of Foucauldians in the world. I don't know if they are here. I'm not sure. I don't know. We think that Foucault is against structuralism. That has nothing to do with structuralism, as he claimed himself at some certain point. So to show that, in fact, you should reread Foucault as a philosopher in the context of the Saussurian impact, you could say, is really very heroic, and it was hard in the Foucauldian French Foucauldian word. It's not a very easy thing to do, but she put so many arguments and documents that I think it's not irrefutable. So she's done that work. So it's we need, at least we, the structuralists, the Saussurian, we the Saussurian need to thank you, because to be a Saussurian in philosophy only makes sense if you can show that someone like Foucault is actually a Saussurian. And that's what you've done, I think. So thank you very much. I had to say it. Sorry about that. So yes, you try to reinscribe that Saussurian gesture that I've made in the history of contemporary philosophy, 20th century philosophy, on two aspects: epistemology first and ontology then. The two aspects, basically. And you ask what structuralism, what is Dionysian structuralism, mean for both the epistemological debates of the 20th century and for the ontological debates of the 20th century. As for the first one, the epistemological question, you focused on the relation between the empirical and the transcendental, and so I see it now is that in order to understand the kind of positions or the kind of gesture that Foucault has made in this particular debate about epistemology, that is about the nature of knowledge and the meaning of knowledge, the best way to understand what he's done is to actually abandon the distinction and the couple transcendental and empirical, and to replace it by the question of the precisely of the ontology of, or rather, as you say, the being of language or the being of knowledge, what it is for knowledge to be. So being of knowledge means that we don't only know things. The fact that we know, in a way, appears to us within the kinds of things we know and within the kind of practices of knowledge that we are familiar with. So the very existence of knowledge itself is imminently, if you want, represented or manifested within the practices of knowledge. That is Foucault's position. And Foucault's position is also to say there is not one being of knowledge. There is not one way by which knowledge can appear within a set of symbolic practices, if you want, we should relativize and historicize the very being of knowledge. So that's a completely different understanding of the historical epistemology. So it's not anymore a history, for instance, of the concepts, like, for instance, Canguilhem did that. He made a history of the concept of life through biology. So the theories, so what Foucault has suggested is that there is also a history, and if you want, also an anthropology or a geography, time and space, as two dimensions of variation. There is a history of the very determination of something like knowing within a culture, if you want. And anthropologists should be more interested in that, because to know is not kind of a universal practice that every human being has. It's not that we know, but that there are different ways of knowing and different things we think we know. No, it's that the fact that there is something like knowledge as a problem does not exist as a universal, obvious thing. That is what I think Foucault, as a Dionysian structuralist or a Saussurian, introduces in the very problematic of epistemology. That is, he introduces the ontology of knowledge itself. And that, I think, is overcomes the distinction between the empirical and the transcendental. It's beyond that distinction. And it's also, then it includes a way of seeing variation as, or rather, as a way of seeing epistemology as a chapter, what I would call the philosophy of nature. That is, to do historical epistemology is trying to understand how being manifests itself through the way knowledge itself seems to exist for the people who are within a particular frame of knowledge. Is that clear? Yeah. Okay. So Naturphilosophie rather than empiricism or transcendentalism. Basically, Deleuze rather than Kant. That's more or less the direction. So for that, for the first, and for the second question about the basically Saussure against Heidegger, Saussure with Heidegger. Derrida trying to put them two together. So the semiological difference and the ontological difference would go together. And I have the impression that you answered yourself in a way to your own question by referring to my own text. Because you know how I see it. I think that the fact that there is an ontological problem, that it's a problem not only with what there is, but with the very way or the very meaning of the verb to be. That fact for Heidegger is linked, if you want, to it's a kind of a general or universal possibility. So in the first Heidegger, it's linked to death, right? It's because we are dying, we are mortal, then we can relate to the fact that there is being, if you want, the fact that there is, as a problem. So that's why I say it's negation here. It's a possibility that there is nothing that makes of the fact that there is something a problem. So otherwise, of course, we would be just immersed. And Heidegger think that animals, in a way, are like that. We would just be immersed in things that are. We would not realize that it's odd that there is, right? It's because we are visited by the possibility that there is not, that we are interested, or that we can problematize the very being. So my position, as you say, is simply that no, it's only when we bump when we meet, when we encounter a kind of break in our ordinary analogy of being, that is, we realize that thing in particular is incompatible with another thing. So for instance, the sign, as I've described, is only made of differences. It always varies. It is spiritual but real. So clearly, it doesn't match the way we understand what it is to be. Or it seems that there are different beings for which to be doesn't mean the same thing. And that is, for me, the source of an ontological question. And that is always super important. And for instance, democracy is an ontological challenge because it means that people who don't know anything, who are not experts, actually should decide. So it's a philosophical challenge. So I think that's my answer. I think it is my answer.
We cannot follow Derrida.
So no, I think Derrida exactly is, Derrida has a problem here. The main problem I see with Derrida is my problem with Derrida is that he doesn't take seriously. So Derrida thinks that there are ways of construing or framing what it is to be that are embedded in our tradition. And that we should basically play with this tradition, that's deconstruction, we should play with this tradition, rewrite the text and so on, so as to liberate other ways by which certain way of being can mean something for us. And in doing that, he has a kind of reflective movement over the philosophical tradition. And the worst thing, really, that I think Derrida has done in this famous in 1966, in a conference that was organized in order to introduce structuralism in the United States, and which in fact ended up introducing deconstruction in the United States. Therefore, the United States never met structuralism because they introduced structuralism, and at the same time they thought that structuralism was over. So they never were visited by a structuralist hero. So it's not like psychoanalysis, right? When Freud arrived in New York, he said, "I'm bringing plague, the plague," like, and it actually works more or less, right? The United States is a psychoanalytical country. But for structuralism, no, zero. So the United States, which was actually one of the source, New York was the place where Jacobson and Lévi-Strauss met, and that was in a way the beginning of structuralism. But in fact, in a way, they were never visited by structuralism. So if you want, the United States is surrounded by structuralist forces, and we should make an alliance between Brazil and France, Porto Alegre and Paris, in order to crush down this non-structuralist hegemony. But so and then something terrible happened because Derrida criticized Lévi-Strauss for having an ontological understanding, an understanding of what it is to be that was linked to the Western tradition, to his own tradition. And that the problem with Lévi-Strauss is that he was not reflective enough about the history of philosophy. Bottom line, people then should simply read again Rousseau, Montesquieu, Aristotle, Saint Thomas d'Aquin, and forget about the Guarani, forget about the Gororo, forget about all those intellectual traditions that Lévi-Strauss was introducing in philosophy. And that is a crime. At that moment, they had committed a crime. Really, because there was a moment where a kind of form of decolonization of the Western tradition was possible, and it was completely erased. Of course, with something that is, amenable for academia. We're going to think in a critical way about our own tradition. Well, you had something else to do. You had to think with traditions, and that is with this Heideggerian trap, which is that we don't yet think what we should think, that we are not yet thinking, and so on. They actually destroy the possibility of thinking in a different way. So, and here Foucault, again, is much better than Derrida, because Foucault made a kind of anthropological move on history. And he showed that there were other ways of being and other ways of thinking within our own tradition. And that is
so
much
Saussurian, he was Saussurian before
Foucault was a sociologist.
Before even realized that he was not a Kantian.
Exactly. So Foucault is part of the line of structuralist heroes, undoubtedly, and we show that very well. Derrida is not. So to be a Saussurian in philosophy is also to resist deconstruction. But thank you for your questions. I'm sorry, again, I'm too much. But maybe our intervention about the many things
Vamos
we've said.
fazer uma ou duas perguntas e depois intervalo, certo? Então, proponho que...
Well, maybe some of us could. I have a question related to question.
Yeah.
I was very curious, and this is also a question of perhaps you can elucidate this historical background. Because comments structuralism in his own reception of this whole debate in the US. But I was thinking that perhaps, since Derrida tends to reduce his reading, at least from what I got from my own reading of Derrida, that was very much confined to Saussurian idea of phonetics. And somehow it seems, would you think that this would be related somehow to the way he tends to place presence? Because the way you just responded to Gabriela, it seems that it goes in this direction, that there was not only that he didn't do justice to structuralism in the way that Foucault would do, relating to logical radicalness of Lévi-Strauss, introduction of native indigenous ways of thinking, the Amazon, for instance, but also related to the very reading of the ontological difference. So just to make clear for everyone, there are lots of things going on in this whole exchange relating to the being of knowledge, the way you characterize it. And as Gabriela introduced her first set of comments, the way Heidegger was responding to the so-called Kant's epistemological revolution. And of course, I cannot think that for Derrida, or at least for many things that go in the direction of a phenomenology, like Gabriela was putting in her notes, her remarks, is very much the neo-Kantian way of structuring the question of being in Heidegger. Even I was thinking of even the word structure that Heidegger and other Germans use it. It's very Kantian in this sense, right? And therefore, perhaps it was very much inviting this ontological turn in Heidegger, in his own critical reading of Husserl. But I had the impression that for Derrida, coming from this Husserlian background, he was trying to criticize Heidegger's very conception of the ontological difference. Precisely. How would you react to this? Because somehow I had the impression that in your book, I didn't read the whole book. By the way,
it's an impossible book.
Yeah, it's
like Saussure's book.
But I was so intrigued.
It's a good way to read it, not to read everything.
The way I was very provoked.
Incomplete.
I was very provoked by your lecture in 2 days ago, your presentation. I thought there were so many questions that I bought your book and I went through the whole book and I found it amazing. I had lots of questions regarding your book, but one thing that struck me in a very strong way was the fact that there are different receptions of structuralism. You just made the case related to Derrida's comments, late 60s, right, in the US. So perhaps Derrida's reading was very much related to the Cours de landscape. And so far as I can tell, it's a partial reading that goes in this direction of the more, let's say, traditional reception we had of Saussure.
Yes, I actually wrote an article in French in a book called Le moment philosophique des années 60. On Saussure and Derrida, which is entitled Thérontologie saussurienne, like it's teratology, means theory of monsters, and thérontologie, theory of being, so monsters, and there can only be an ontological question if there are monsters.
Right. Okay.
Challenge our obvious categories, basically. And then the subtitle is what Derrida hasn't read in the course of general linguistics, but has not read.
Right.
And I did argue there that, as you just said, he has a very partial reading, which is not only, it's very strange because it's based on the course of general linguistics, which is okay, in fact, because that book, if you read the book, general linguistics, it's a completely incoherent book. Completely incoherent book. You could see, it doesn't make sense, but that's the way you understand that there is something more, right? That the disciples didn't understand. So he should have been sensitive to that, but in fact, he was not very sensitive to that because he thought he had already the interpretation, which was the ontology of present thing. So he didn't get the gist of Saussure's position. And but yes, in fact, what I think is that instead of pluralizing the transcendental, as people have done since Kant, in fact, even Kant himself in a way, because Kant, you know, there are three critiques.
Right.
So there's not just one way by which a form of objectivity is construed, because reality for the theoretical reason is not the same as reality for the practical reason, but it's reality. There are two forms of reality. So in fact, in a way, Kant is a bit of an ontological pluralist. But then the post-Kantians, of course, were all of them, Hegel included, all of them thought that you need to pluralize the transcendental. That is, there's just not one way by which. And what Hegel did is that to organize, to say that the variations of forms of objectivities and forms of subjectivities can be put in a system, in a global system. It can be unified. Therefore, there is one philosophy. So therefore, it's not an ontological pluralist anymore. He's just an ontological.
Like a system, right?
Yeah, yes, that's the idea. There is a system of the variation of the transcendental. That's Hegel. But we, the structuralists, in fact, we, the Deleuzians, because that's what Deleuze says in his first published article, which is the article on Hegel's reading by Hippolyte, Logic and Existence. In this first article, he says, look, in fact, you should not be interested in the variation of transcendental, but rather in being as that which expresses itself through this variation. But but it cannot be systematized. So I think today I had that discussion with Eduardo Ribeiro de Castro. Many people are tempted by the idea of historicization of transcendental, pluralization of transcendental, and I should not think of pluralizing the transcendental. You should think of pluralizing being, and you should probably say to be only makes sense because it generates a new way of being.
Right.
The question of being only emerges when ways of being differ. So it is ontological differences.
Right, but this would be already the beginning of phenomenology, right? The manifold ways of talking of being, also in
in the logical investigation.
Right,
absolutely.
Right, logical investigation. Right.
Absolutely, except that then Husserl, you know, in a way, in fact, he says that there is not one thing over which we can have different perspectives, but a different kind of objectivity for each perspective. Like, for instance, the object we love is not the same as the object we touch. Would be a problem in their sexual life, but and so on and so on. So there are different objects, but the way he thinks of each objectivity is on the model of the thing.
Right.
And that I agree with Heidegger. And that I think is precisely because he doesn't have this ontology of the sign.
Right.
And he says exactly the same thing about science.
Right.
And about science, it is not true. That is, a sign is not something over which converge different perspectives or profiles. There is no unity of that kind of science. It's a set of differences. So that's, and when you say that, then you liberate completely the ontological plurality. Maybe we can make a...
I think we should make,
you can ask question in Portuguese.
In Portuguese,
I understand.
I think it's better.
I understand. Entendi.
Bom, então vamos fazer um intervalo. Enquanto
Fiquei
isso,
pensando sobre as
pensa
perguntas.
e retomaremos em 15 minutos.
Ok.
That I jumped into discussion, there was precisely because one of the things I need to ask was that how come you make subtle fixes, you find subtle fixes in Derrida between the sensible intelligence position and he plays a Saussure, you know, it's not great, Saussure. Yeah, but not, they didn't have
Sim. Mas, bom, eu acho que...
Mas tu, se pegasse nesses termos, como você fez essa divisão,
Não, foi o Saussure, foi a primeira parte, eram seis capítulos. A primeira era uma
se me tivesse enfocou, né? Mas a parte das palavras e as coisas, você trouxe essa questão da...
Sim, exatamente. Isso também trabalho. Não, acho que realmente está essa. A probabilidade, tá? Que é
Você apresentou. Eu sei, você perguntou bem sistemático. Bem seguido do que você estava querendo.
Não, como é que vai falar uma coisa? É difícil. Pensa dentro disso, é difícil. É difícil pensar uma coisa transcendental ontológica. Né? Mas é possível e é elegante usar essas linhas que nos dizem que, bom, tem muitos problemas ali, mas quanto mais a gente vai abrindo, mais problemas a gente vai encontrando. Eu acho que eu estou falando com casa.
Pode apesar que essa parte é o problema da filosofia para mim.
Gabriela, você vai amanhã já? Ah, você vai, tá. Ok, vá. Tá. Salvinhos. Vou carregar esse aqui, eu vou ter que sair. Tá? Você.
Sim, vamos junto, né?
Eu vou chamar um Uber.
Se tiver carona, não sei. Ele pode pegar a viranga.
É rápido?
15 minutos. Depois que a gente pegar, 15 minutos.
Então, se você sabe...
Isso. Pegamos.
Então, você. Vou ter que sair no meio da...
Ok, então, retomaremos este workshop em torno da questão do problema ser saussuriano em filosofia, na filosofia. Nesse momento, então, eu passarei a palavra ao professor Vitor Queiroz, do Departamento de Antropologia da UFRGS, que apresentará sua fala em português. Eu vou, então, fazer a tradução consecutiva para francês, só para o professor Maniglier. Vou só ajeitar a câmera.
Bom, muito livremente, senhor Vitor. Você pode me fazer? Muito livremente aqui, senhor Vitor.
Provavelmente je voudrais inclure c'est l'image qui apparaît sur l'écran. Et je vais baisser l'écran.
Boa tarde, obrigado pelo convite, quero agradecer o convite ao professor Norman, a Gabriela, a Patrice está aqui. Eu estou há exatamente uma semana debatendo, discutindo com o Patrice, né, de quinta a quinta. Então, acho que eu vou colocar algumas questões mesmo, já, né, ou seja, já pulando a parte de apresentar muito alguma coisa, já colocando algumas questões. Mas primeiro, né, de onde eu faço uma espécie de estranho no ninho aqui, porque eu faço antropologia estrutural, enfim, né? Prefiro o nome método estrutural por uma razão muito simples, né? O Levi-Strauss nos anos 60, início dos anos 70, quando, né, a ideia, ele usava o palavra estruturalismo bastante, né, mas no final dos anos 60, início dos anos 70, quando, né, tem uma voga muito popular, ele prefere usar cada vez mais o nome de antropologia estrutural por uma razão muito específica, né, que é o seguinte, que é a defesa, né, que é, falo do lado como um cientista, né, faço uma ciência, e essa ciência, né, o método estrutural, enfim, e diria mais, uma sensibilidade estrutural, é uma ferramenta de conhecimento valiosíssimo, né, e um conhecimento exatamente não só, o conhecimento é uma defesa não só da diferença do outro, né, mas que só pode se entender, só pode acontecer por meio da diferença. Então, assim, a famosa ideia, né, levi-straussiana da unidade da espécie, ele mantém isso, a unidade do espírito, a unidade da espécie, mas essa unidade só pode ser vista em sua variação, né, em sua diversidade. Então, essa é uma ideia muito importante, né, e que coloca, então, a antropologia não só como uma ciência, mas como uma ciência absoluta, né, como uma espécie de meta-ciência. Nos anos 40, 50, especialmente, ele defendia isso com uma espécie de híbris, muito, né? Enfim, depois ele vai ficando velho e vai deixando um pouquinho essa híbris. Mas é uma ciência absoluta e jamais totalitária, né? E também, seguindo esse diálogo, uma ciência, né, romântica, presentes que acho que a gente trocou, presentes intelectuais que a gente trocou esses dias. Uma ciência romântica, uma ciência surrealista, e também, né, defendo isso, né, tem, né, embora o Levi-Strauss não expresse isso, mas algo que lembra bastante, algo análogo a uma ciência spinozana também, né, exatamente nesse sentido do contingente, do possível, enfim, que em algum momento, no quarto capítulo da Ética, o Spinoza vai fazer uma diferença, mas enfim, mas em geral ele coloca junto contingente possível ou, né, necessário em ato, né, exatamente essa união dessas duas coisas. Bom, a primeira coisa assim, né, que eu queria levantar, né, a ideia, né, que você falou ontem no lançamento do livro lá na UFRGS, né, de que para o Saussure, de que a inteligência artificial, digamos, onde ela mais tem problema é exatamente na ideia de percepção ou de sensação. Todo o resto não vai bem, né? Mas a ideia é que, ou seja, a ideia central, né? Ou seja, a ideia de, né, compartilhamento de sensações e né, um filtro perceptivo. Depois eu vou ler um trechinho aqui do Pensamento Selvagem sobre isso, mas eu só queria já posicionar, e acho que essa é a primeira pergunta, a primeira questão, vai para uma espécie de humanismo, que para mim é um humanismo radical do Lévi-Strauss, radical mesmo, né? Porque assim, um humanismo que é tão amplo que pode abarcar outros que não são humanos também, né? Enfim, sabemos via os mitos, tratados mitológicas, que aprendemos a ser humano com as onças, com as jiboias, enfim, né? Ou seja, a cultura humana estava, né? Logicamente a cultura humana pertence ao outro, né? Então isso para mim é muito interessante. Mas há nisso um humanismo radical, e para mim aqui o humano parece como meio, nos dois sentidos do francês, moyen e milieu, né? Me parece exatamente humano, me parece meio. Bom, e eu estou falando isso, né? Há uma discussão, na verdade uma discussão que não existiu, uma discussão de gerações diferentes, mas uma discussão dos anos 40 e 50 do Alan Turing, enfim, um decifrador, né? Um desencriptador, e que dizia que há um preconceito metafísico, né, de que a mente humana tivesse qualquer especificidade. Isso para ele, ou seja, no final das contas, a mente humana seria decomponível em coisas computacionais, né? E tem uma figura, que para mim é um campeão, é um físico, um campeão da posição contrária, que é o Roger Penrose, que eu adoro, né? Que exatamente é o cara que ganhou um Nobel pela identificação dos buracos negros, inclusive na história de Lince ele é citado na última página. Enfim, coisas que o Lévi-Strauss vai deixando na obra dele sem dizer muita coisa a mais. Mas o Penrose tem exatamente a ideia de que a mente humana tem uma complexidade tal, não sei se tal ou de outra qualidade, que nenhuma máquina poderia, enfim, né, poderia competir com ela. E talvez, né, eu acho que essa ideia de sensação e percepção, né, encontrada no Saussure deu uma bela resposta em direção a isso. Outra resposta, que eu acho muito bonita no Lévi-Strauss, é a fragilidade do ser humano, né? Eu acho que quando ele encontra os Ambiquara, digamos, um enternecimento... lembrando, os Ambiquara são um povo do Brasil Central e, basicamente, princípios básicos da antropologia estrutural estão ali, né? A ideia da divisão, a ideia de cunhados, a ideia de troca matrimonial, enfim, isso é diretamente teoria de Ambiquara, né? E que ele, né, imediatamente identifica e, né, bricola com outras coisas. Mas, né, o que chama mais atenção em relação aos Ambiquara, para o Lévi-Strauss, é a fragilidade, né? Ou seja, como esses seres humanos podem ser tão lindos, tão bonitos, ter uma vida simbólica tão rica, se eles vivem nus, deitados no chão, com um mínimo do mínimo de vida material, né, com uma espécie de visão grandiosa, né, do céu do Cerrado brasileiro, e aqueles seres humanos pequenininhos ao redor de foguetes, né? Para mim, a imagem é muito bonita. Enfim, então, a primeira coisa, que essa primeira defesa, é exatamente essa defesa frente a uma mente maquinal, essa defesa de um meio humano e de uma fragilidade humana. E eu queria lembrar, evidentemente, falando das eleições de ontem do Trump e antes das eleições de Bolsonaro no Brasil, né, o risco das inteligências artificiais, se elas são usadas com algoritmos muito simples, ou seja, que não se aproximam da mente humana, mas esses algoritmos muito simples podem provocar estragos que são de ordem, né, de ordem maior, como, por exemplo, disseminação de fake news e etc. Então, só essa primeira defesa. E aí, sobre isso, né, não quero entrar muito aqui na ideia de função semântica, função simbólica, e essa defasagem, né, significante-significado, que é isso, né? Para mim, é menos uma arbitrariedade do que uma defasagem, exatamente essa ideia de redobramento necessário, né, imediatamente, e a ideia, né, que eu acho que isso que eu vou defender aqui a partir de um trechinho do Pensamento Selvagem, que eu não acredito que uma máquina faça isso aqui, né? que é né, esse arranjo constitui uma espécie de aparelho conceitual que filtra a unidade através da multiplicidade, a multiplicidade através da unidade, a diversidade através da identidade e a identidade através da diversidade. Ou seja, né, o pensamento selvagem, a mente humana é capaz de fazer isso aqui, né? Dotado de extensão teoricamente ilimitada no seu nível mediano e que pode se contrair ou se expandir enfim, pode se contrair ou se expandir, né? Ele está falando de dois polos, né? Dois polos do uso da língua, né? Para esses dois polos do imotivado, arbitrário ou motivado, né? Então, você pode estender ou diminuir para esses dois polos, e, ao fazer isso, a mente humana faz uma forma de torção. Um jeito belíssimo de colocar a questão. Então, isso é a primeira questão. A segunda tem a ver com a ideia de pensamento selvagem, né? Porque no colóquio, a gente estava falando, né? Para mim tem possivelmente duas formas de entender isso aqui, né? Enfim, infelizmente deixei a capa lá. Mas, enfim, na orelha da primeira edição, que é essa aqui, o Lévi-Strauss defende uma espécie de, enfim, o pensamento selvagem como uma espécie de pensamento base, né? O pensamento humano em si, uma espécie de pensamento que estaria... obrigado. Né? Mas está nessa orelhinha aqui final, né? Você tem essa defesa. Então, isso por um lado. Então, digamos, pensamento selvagem, senso 1. Pensamento selvagem, senso 2, seria exatamente o pensamento macroscópico, né? Ou seja, de olhar exatamente, né, nos indivíduos, espécies, números, categorias, né, posicionar questões. E aí, né, eu coloco isso só para exatamente, ou seja, essa possível dupla significação da ideia de pensamento selvagem, né, exatamente para infletir sobre a ideia saussuriana. Eu estou lendo trechos do 5º capítulo do Pensamento Selvagem, que é o capítulo em que ele mais dialoga com Saussure, né? E com Jacobson também. Mas aqui, né, que é uma coisa muito, como chama, lapidar, né? O problema da relação, rapport, entre contínuo e descontínuo, recebe, assim, uma solução original, ou seja, desse modelo de pensamento. Porque o universo é representado sobre a forma de um contínuo feito de oposições sucessivas, né? Eu acho que é um jeito também muito interessante de colocar, digamos, esses dois sentidos, se é que são dois sentidos, da noção de pensamento selvagem. Também queria te ouvir um pouco sobre isso. Terceira coisa, eu botei um título aqui meio escalafobético, na oficina do bricoleiro, porque e aí é realmente de uma experiência do mundo sensível. Lá em São Paulo, uma das coisas mais legais que eu fui foi na oficina de um bricoleiro, na oficina de alguém que constrói instrumentos. E é um lugar que eu fico muito feliz, muito contente quando vejo um bricoleiro trabalhando. Para mim, eu falei, agora eu estou aprendendo, né? Para mim, eu sempre tenho essa sensação. Né, essa ideia de por que na oficina do bricoleiro? A pergunta direta aqui é o seguinte: essa percepção do contínuo no descontínuo e do que a gente estava falando antes, ou seja, essa espécie de gradiente perceptivo, né, ele pode, digamos, usando a ideia de modelo levi-straussiano, que é uma ideia realmente muito científica, né, ou seja, de abordar a realidade via modelos. Vou te perguntar diretamente por que não Jacobson e por que não a cibernética, né? E já adianto que eu acho que entendo o seu desconforto porque são modelos de fato mecânicos, são modelos simplificadores, né? E que não sobem, digamos assim, para modelos estatísticos ou modelos de permutação, né? Mas a mesma coisa se dá com a talvez oposição, que não é oposição, que acho que na aula inaugural, na lição inaugural, ele coloca muito bem a questão de exagero de indução, exagero de dedução, exagero de modelo mecânico, exagero de modelo estatístico. Ou seja, tem um terceiro ente surgindo aqui, né, se você vai metodologicamente para dois exageros, né? Então, assim, uma espécie de ciência, nesse caso, bem esquizofrênica, né? Que vai para cá e quer atingir uma terceira coisa. Então, assim, é uma pergunta bem simples e bem direta mesmo, né? Da possibilidade de usar os modelos jacobsonianos e cibernéticos não como uma imagem do real ou como um fim, porque aí eu, de fato, concordo que a gente chega em lugares muito ruins, inclusive pensando em inteligência artificial, mas enquanto meio, e aqui boiando, né? Meio de ferramenta de entendimento. E já, inclusive, pegando a sua provocação de que a ferramenta, o TIB, é também um sim. E aí, enfim, acho que eu queria seguir esse diálogo contigo. Quarta e última coisinha é que exatamente porque, enfim, por que Levi-Strauss me apaixona tanto, né? Mas é exatamente essa possibilidade, e porque eu comecei falando de inteligência artificial, é uma defesa aqui da criatividade humana, uma defesa, acho que intransigente, da diversidade humana, mas também da criatividade humana, né? E tem uma outra coisa aqui, que no empreendimento antropológico, no empreendimento não só etnográfico, mas um empreendimento, enfim, antropológico, né? E nessa ida ao chão empírico, nessa ida ao detalhe de cada cultura, de cada coisa, né? Tem não só um empreendimento do conhecimento cognoscível, mas também tem um prazer. Acho muito interessante essa ideia levi-straussiana de prazer em ver, né? Ou seja, no final das contas, me parece, né, que assim, o fim, né, a finalidade da antropologia levi-straussiana seja, né, ou seja, o conhecimento parece um meio, mas a finalidade parece um prazer, né? Parece, enfim, enfim. E esse prazer, eu acho interessante, e aí também coloco uma questão diretamente de atuação política em relação a estruturalismo, é o seguinte: para mim é possível, né, extrair do Levi-Strauss uma defesa não subjetiva da diversidade, ou seja, uma defesa categórica da diversidade, né, e da variação, ou seja, uma defesa que não tem argumentação contra, né, que é exatamente uma defesa de que todo e qualquer sistema, quanto mais variado ele for, né, enfim, até um ponto ótimo em que ele se transforma em outra coisa, evidentemente, mas ele é cada vez mais rico. Ou seja, evidentemente, um sistema menos diverso é um sistema morto, né? Então, aqui, para mim, há uma defesa, que é isso, ela não é moral, isso é muito interessante, se desvia de várias defesas. Defenda o índio porque o índio é legal. Não, o índio não precisa ser legal, né? Não precisa ser uma questão moral, né? E não precisa ser uma questão subjetiva, né? Eu não preciso gostar, né, do outro para defender intransigentemente a existência do outro, né? E, por fim, acho que a última coisa é que uma noção muito interessante que está, né, no início do Produzido, quando ele vai falar do espírito humano, tem uma coisa muito enigmática, tem umas coisas meio oraculares assim, né, na obra do Straussiano. Mas quando ele fala, né, enfim, os meus críticos fiquem à vontade, porque eu não vou repartir o butim, ou seja, não vou repartir, como é o butim em francês, não vou repartir o espólio de guerra, né? O espírito humano é indivisível, ou seja, o patrimônio da humanidade, o espírito é patrimônio de todos, né? E ele é indivisível. Isso eu acho muito interessante, né? Porque me parece que é uma fractalidade do espírito, ou seja, cada cultura humana não é uma parcela do espírito humano, é o espírito humano inteiro, né? Que já que o espírito humano só pode se manifestar em situações concretas, empíricas, né? É ali que ele se manifesta não como uma parcela, como ele se manifesta inteiro. Isso, para mim, tem uma possibilidade de defesa política absolutamente arrasadora, né? Por que não se deve destruir uma casa de reza guarani? Por que não se deve destruir um terreiro? Não é porque eles são legais, porque eles são interessantes culturalmente, é porque se você destruir aquilo, você literalmente está destruindo a humanidade inteira naquele ponto, ou seja, a humanidade se torna infinitamente mais pobre, né? Porque você, digamos, exclui uma das suas variações, né? E ao excluir uma das suas possibilidades de variação, você acaba excluindo ela inteira. né? Então, são essas questões que eu queria te colocar. Merci.
Félicitations. Peut-être sortir de ça.
Bon, qu'est-ce que je
Oui,
rapidement peut-être.
oui.
Ah, sorry, it was in English, I suppose.
English. Yeah,
Yes,
English.
yes.
Sorry.
English?
Yeah.
Okay, so first, thank you again. Second time, or maybe the third time, fourth time, so it can be counted. Saying it, let's say it. Okay, that was one of the great pleasures of this coming here to encounter you. I'm very happy. It's a good sign, I think, for the world today, for humanity as a whole, that you actually exist. But thank you. Yes, you said a few things that, many things that I think are very interesting. I share, if I have understood you well, I share the emphasis you put on the notion of the human. And this is a little paradoxical for structuralists as me, probably as you, but I think, indeed, anti-humanism is not a way of disregarding the category of humanity, it's a way of redefining it. And Lévi-Strauss was someone who actually, yes, had this famous paper, Humanism. And I think it's very important because today, particularly today, where it is clear that there are many reasons on the distinction between the human and the non-human. For that very reason, we need actually also to say something about what it means to be human. Because, in fact, in a way, I said that to Vitor de Castro recently. I said, in fact, you are interested in the object of anthropology, the most traditional object of anthropology, which is the human, except that you are interested in the variations of the human. And I think there is no example of a symbolic world where humanity, in the sense of the species of us, has not been part of not been at the center of the cosmology. And so, and I think today actually we have good reason to think that humanity is a singularity, precisely because humanity is the first terrestrial being that has the capacity of modifying its own way of being, way of acting, in reference to the consequences in the far distant future, sometimes the far distant places. And I think that has never happened ever. So you can redefine humanity. And saying this, I think it's very important. And it's, we need anthropology in that sense, even though it's not in form of exceptionalism. It's not that I'm saying that humanity is it's just a form of, it's a particularity. The human is a particular form of terrestrial being. And maybe structural anthropology can help us understand that. So I am very sympathetic to inventivity. I will speak of inventivity. I think the concept of creation is a theological concept that refers to the relation between nothing and something, ex nihilo. Invention is the word we need. And invention has to do with bricolage and with the idea of finitude. So we do with what we have, and it's a rather finite, but always a little more than we thought it was. That's invention. And what I call the symptom in my work with psychoanalysis, with Silvia Lippi, invention. It's the symptom. The symptom is a way of reinventing one's own body. So I think invention is more a better concept to capture the kind of variation that we have here. I was very sensitive to the notion of pleasure, and I want to end with this concept of the ethics, the ethical aspect of structuralism. And here you are being a structuralist hero. You're a hero, trying to embody a form of ethics. And what you're saying, I think, is very, very true. There are many texts where Lévi-Strauss says it too. simple, is that so we should value difference because difference is the only way there is value. That's what you mean when you say it's not subjective. It's that it's a principle. It's a meta. It's not a meta ethics. It's a kind of self-confirming ethics. That is, it would not make any sense to speak of a value if there was no difference. Universality is never enough for anything to be valued. Value is indifference, in singularity. Therefore, we should destroy difference. You destroy it's a very kind of Kantian argument. You destroy the very possibility of valuing anything in general. So it's a kind of categorical imperative in Kant's sense. So we need to do some work to explain that it's not universality, as Kant thought, but difference that is at the heart of the category imperative. But I think that would be basically the idea that there is no difference between being and value. For something to be valued, it needs to exist, but for it to exist, it needs to differ. And when it differs, it creates a particular form of value. And so he says at a certain point, a thing has a value because precisely, as you said about fragility, it could disappear. So it is because of its singularity that it has a value. We cherish something because it could not be. If it could be forever, we would have no reason to cherish it now. Implication, no subjective attachment to it, right? We have an attachment because it could go away, it could vanish. So it is the fragility of it that makes its own value. So there is in Lévi-Strauss kind of ethics of the care. Why, when we do structural anthropology, I include actually structural anthropology, structural linguistics, and so on. You mean when we describe the differences we are made of, we also clarify what we could cherish or not. So knowledge, and I think Foucault is someone who understood that very well. So description is enough actually to intensify the relation to the difference we are making and therefore that we cherish. So a structuralist hero is a descriptive hero. It's not a normative hero. You don't, just as we don't need meaning on the top of science, we don't need norms on the top of actions. An action is itself a value bearer. Thank you very much. Merci, merci. Bon voyage à toi aussi. Un voyage being different.
Thank you, Victor.
Algumas perguntas. Eu tenho uma, não é uma pergunta, é só uma ilustração para de um outro campo de conhecimento para o que foi falado aqui em 3 questões, que é a sensação e percepção, né, a torção e as oposições sucessivas, né, que o Vitor falou. Aconteceu na URGS agora, o Comitê Brasileiro de História da Arte, alguns dias atrás, e eu participei e eu assisti uma comunicação de uma pesquisadora doutoranda da UDESC, em que ela traz um estudo de caso do livro Frankenstein, em que um prêmio literário Jabuti, que existe aqui no Brasil, que ganhou o prêmio de ilustração, né? E aí depois se descobriu que as ilustrações foram feitas por inteligência artificial. Foi revelado e aí a premiação foi retirada. Né? E aí ela passou o livro para todos, né? E aí os historiadores da arte que estavam ali, todos, etc., começaram a dizer, não, isso é século XIX, essas ilustrações, isso lembra século XIX, todos voltavam a isso. O que eu estou trazendo como ilustração aqui, com referência a isso, da inteligência artificial. E a inteligência artificial passa, a partir de agora, a ser objeto de pesquisa, com alguns problemas para a história da arte. A pergunta mais óbvia é: a inteligência artificial é capaz de construir imagens artísticas? O que parece é que, pegando, falou, Vitor, essa incapacidade de sensação e percepção, a inteligência artificial é muito capaz de se apropriar mais rapidamente do tesouro humano, né, do que nós. Mas, por enquanto, parece que ela é incapaz de fazer, de ter essa sensação e percepção, não realizar a torção, porque ela pegou o contexto do Frankenstein e montou imagens daquele momento histórico da história da arte, século XIX, e muito menos oposições sucessivas. Então, acho que a preocupação ali daquele grupo de historiadores da arte era que, no momento em que a inteligência artificial conseguir fazer bricolagens, conseguir fazer colagens ou fazer colagens em oposição, aí é preocupante. Daí preocupante no sentido que parece que ela passa a ter um componente humano, como tu falou, né? Que por enquanto ela não tem, é mecânico. Eu só trouxe isso para ilustrar como essa discussão em torno da cibernética ela parece que está perpassando diversos campos do estudo da imagem, da linguística, obviamente, né? Mas só isso, só me deu esse toque dessa questão das oposições sucessivas. Isso aqui parece importante para a discussão nesse campo da cibernética.
Eu também queria ouvir o Maniglier, mas brevemente, tipo assim, para mim o problema é a IA, né? Pegando um gancho do que o Maniglier acabou de falar, esse humanismo do Lévi-Strauss é um humano, esse espírito humano, ele compõe com a realidade inteira. Então, assim, de certa forma, as coisas literalmente fazem parte do espírito humano, porque ele só pode significar com elas, por meio delas. Né? Então, assim, o espírito humano equivale também a tudo que ele percebe, né? E aí tem essa inversão lévi-straussiana, tudo que atravessa ele, né? Então, assim, no final das contas, os signos, as coisas, os mitos costumam atravessar o espírito, né? Qual o problema, especificamente, dessa discussão, do prêmio, da IA? Para mim, duas coisas. Primeiro, uma ideia totalitária, ou seja, evidentemente tem interesses em que exista algo, pode ser uma máquina, pode ser qualquer outra coisa, que resolva rapidamente todos os nossos problemas, ou seja, né, e que a gente dê a essa instância exatamente esse poder decisório, resolutivo, sei lá o quê, enfim, né, uma centralidade que isso não deveria ter. Ou seja, para mim a questão não é a IA, mas é colocar no colo da IA, né, enfim, muita coisa, e a IA virar algo totalizante. O que eu disse, por exemplo, em relação a algoritmos, disseminação de fake news, etc., os algoritmos de Instagram e Facebook, eles são muito simples, eles são primários, eles são dos anos 40. Né? Só que uma coisa primária é capaz de mudar uma eleição. É impressionante como... Não é assim, um uso muito sofisticado de algoritmo, mas assim, dado as coisas que você viu, eu vou te entregar ou não determinadas outras. É primário, né? Mas esse primário faz com que, por exemplo, enfim, não só isso, mas faz com que o Trump seja eleito de lavada, né? Tem muito a ver com o uso muito, muito inteligente de inteligências maquinais, né? Então, assim, o problema, para mim, vai isso. E o outro problema, na mesma direção, ou seja, outro problema totalizante, é porque exatamente isso, é a ideia de final. Assim, eu costumo falar, desculpa que a piada é mórbida, mas eu costumo falar de quem gosta de solução final é nazista. Porque, de fato, a ideia de solução final né, é o termo que os nazistas criaram para matar gente, né, em grande quantidade. Eu acho que diz muito, né, essa ideia de solução final. Ou seja, a ideia de que você tem... Ou seja, essa ideia de filtrar a diversidade, a multiplicidade, enfim, essa ideia de filtragens eternas e sucessivas, é algo muito do humano de repetir, refazer, re-ritualizar, né? Enfim, ou seja, esse interesse em não morrer as questões, né? Não morrer fisicamente, interesse em não deixar as questões acabadas. Qual o problema com uma ideia de que existem instâncias, sejam elas a inteligência artificial, seja ela a academia, não importa, mas instâncias que resolvam o problema? Eu dou a resposta, eu cheguei no lugar certo. Eu acho muito ruim, né? A ideia de que tenha alguma instância, seja ela qual for, que seja capaz de bater na mesa e dizer assim, cheguei. Eu acho que isso, para mim, é o...
Oi.
Can I comment on this because then I could return to
Sure. Well, we'll go till 6 o'clock then.
right.
Não, tem mais, porque tem duas, tem duas.
No, because I thought he had a good point regarding intelligence. You know, we have many research groups going on here at PUC with humanities and AI. In your response to this provocation, your last talk is ago here. I understood very much the direction of what Vitor just said. But it's true that the idea of AGI, right, artificial general intelligence, this is where the danger or the apocalyptic threat to humankind seems to be, detected by some people like Harari and other people talking about dystopian scenarios. Is whenever could be a point where artificial intelligence would be capable of introducing these elements of torsion, etc., that you mentioned, or of what Kant called reflexive judgment, like the third critique relating to art and aesthetics. That's why Mozart, Bach, or Beethoven were examples of genius for Kant, because they do not follow only patterns. That's the difference. They can break all known patterns. It's completely different from the kind of AI we have today. Not to mention, of course, Instagram or Facebook, because as I said, it's ridiculous. It's only, for Trump and Bolsonaro electors that will be manipulated by, this very simplistic, instrumental use of AI. But the danger is that if you think that someone capable in this kind of AI systems could be capable of producing a Michelangelo's David sculpture or anything like that. But this is where we have many reservations about this possibility, at least so far as for perception, everything. The whole thing of the sensibilia or the Aristotelian sense of taste, a distinctive feature of humanity. But I think that my question regarding your presentation today would be very much related to the way you seem to be very convincing in your defense of structuralism as a way of avoiding, let's say, this opposition between rationalist and empiricist approaches to philosophical problems, even though we consider Kant himself and Husserl, we're also trying to come up with some kind of transcendental solution to this opposition, but also in terms of avoiding these so-called continental analytic divide. So this would be one question that I'd like to hear you offer some response, because if this is the case, I was very curious to see how you respond to, for instance, the second Wittgenstein's takes on the nature of language, moving away from the tractatus towards philosophical investigations, where he's going to say that if a lion could talk, we could not understand, right? This is a very intriguing aphorism by Wittgenstein. And please correct me if I misunderstood something, but I had the impression he was referring to human life forms and to this whole thing of a social, cultural, symbolic context of a meaning in which, let's say, constitutional element would be so decisive that even it's not only a problem of whatever could be translatable in terms of a lion-like language, but the life forms of lion lives, right, or something like that. But I was just curious to see how you place them then in a situation this saying by Wittgenstein vis-a-vis the rationalist empiricist approach. Because, of course, this is very controversial not only among analytic philosophers, but also in terms of continental philosophers who try to say that Derrida and post-structuralists seem to be getting closer to what Wittgenstein himself was trying to do. Analytic philosophy is critical analysis of language, starting with Frege and Russell. And a second question relating to this programmatic question, your apology, let's say, or your plaidoyer for structuralism, is precisely relating to this continental analytic divide. I think that Professor Madarasz here has been the real ambassador of structuralism in Brazil, because for many people, including myself, when I was doing my doctoral dissertation on Foucault's response to Habermas' philosophical discourse of modernity, someone who was more trained as Habermas as my advisor, I was first doing my work with Sheila Benavente. Finish it. But was that they realized that Habermas was very unfair in his criticisms of Foucault's conception of normativity, which he called crypto-normativism. But the point is that overall, not only analytic philosophers would be unfair in their evaluation of continental philosophy, including Saussure, or the Saussurian way of doing philosophy, as we were talking about this afternoon. But even among continental philosophers, which was the case with Habermas in his very nasty criticisms against Foucault, Derrida, Castoriadis, well, it's a coincidence, they were all French, they were all supposed to be a post-structuralist. And as a German philosopher himself, like Tugendhat, he said, well, but we cannot say that this was a sin of youth by Habermas. No, it was supposed to be a very serious work. Habermas was very serious about his criticisms of French so-called post-structuralism. But it seems that there is a problem in a misunderstanding of the whole thing of what French contemporary philosophy is all about. And so this would be my question for you in terms of, I was thinking of Vincent de Comte's famous book, Le Même et l'Autre, because at least in the US, the reception of this book could be different from the way it was received in France or on the continent. And when you mentioned this whole thing about Derrida's talk about modern, it seems to me that it was as someone who spent 4.5 years in France for my studies in philosophy, and then I moved to the US, I could realize that the American reception of French philosophy was somehow different, and it could favor this kind of caricature of structuralism as normal. So it would help us understand this, that this is a bad reading of structuralism, many authors, because this whole thing of identity and difference in the way that many Americans receive French philosophy. Today, they speak of it as a celebration of difference, but still it seems that for many English-speaking philosophers, they would say that, well, this is very, no, this is not philosophy after all. It's almost like, common sense discussion about whether you want to vote for Trump or Kamala Harris. So I'd like to see how you respond to this. Do you see is there a problem in the perception of this analytic continental divide relating to this question of identity and difference? Precisely when some people think that the problem with this so-called continental reading of French post-structuralism is that it's not rigorous, makes sense of a logical, semantic coherence in their own. I think you can think of the reception of Levinas, many of these authors. Norman remembers when we just recently had a Foucault colloquium here in Brazil, and you had to see how analytic colleagues of ours they just make fun of it. These are juvenile people. Someone even came to the point of posting on Facebook saying that, well, this is the reason why Brazil has become such a bad place to do philosophy. It's because of the French influence in Brazil. One of the guys, and this is a guy who is a full professor in the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, a good friend of mine, a Kantian scholar. But it's ridiculous, blame on the French. That's well, Levi-Strauss. That's where everything started. Levi-Strauss, he inaugurated, the French School of Philosophy in São Paulo, and that's where we got to this point of doing all this stupid, silly, pub conversation. That's how they call it. Conversa de botequim. You have a beer and you start talking about soccer and other things. And this is how we do philosophy. And that's how they understand that philosophy, continental, or it's like bricolage. That's the very way you think of it. So I'd be very glad if you could respond to this, because even as we announced Patrice talks here at PUC, I saw that one of the guys said, well, that's a problem. You see that we can put anything on Facebook. That's a good place where you. It's very good to see how people react to the way you have discussions like this. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure learning from you and getting to very interesting discussions about so many different topics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nythamar, for this very generous presence of yours here. That is very intensive. So about the second Wittgenstein and practice, meaning and practice of sense. I have actually been Wittgensteinian critique of the structural tradition, in particular illustrated by Descamps in France. And this is what basically I'd say the problem with the notion of practice. That there is a problem with the units of practice, what it is to do something that is being done, that is being in use. So it means that there is a necessary cultural understanding of practice. Cultural sense that is, there's no practice if there are no units of practice. Correct. Customs. If you do something, it's not a purely behavioral processes. To do something is performance. To perform. Therefore, it's circular argument, right? In fact, we need to have a linguistic understanding of practice and not a pragmatic reduction of language. Right. So,
Yes.
we get back to our this one. And I think we actually can understand lions, and we always understand lions. And actually, myths are ways of letting other species ways of speaking speak in our way of speaking. Right. It's an attempt at hearing. So you could say, oh no, it's just a projection. Well, and then it means that just a projection you already know. Right. Or you could at least, see that, as a few years ago, so there are changes of perspective going on. It's not true that we don't appreciate it, really. And it's typical of an urban European modern thinker who has no trophic interactions with lions. If you live with lions, you have to exchange with lions. If you live in Vienna, you don't exchange with lions. No wonder, right? But you do have a commerce and exchange with other things, futures, well, but probably buildings, but not cars and so on. So I think it's we should not let. And then the third, I think, argument against Patrice Maniglier, and I'm sorry to say that because I have immense admiration for Wittgenstein. Existential. To think that it means something. For me, it's an example. Basically, what he understands is that there is no unique function of language, and that meaning, in the sense of Hegel reference, cannot define the nature of language. And that is right. Meaning of language as and so that's why he says, language could be used to mean something, but it could be used for order, and that is true, but that is an entirely functionalist position, and it has nothing to do, I think, by some people, well, also discussed by other academics. People understood that very well. We understood that Wittgenstein was not trying to science to practices, that in particular not to practices understood in a behavioral sense. That is a deep disinterest. And there is no possibility of defining what it is for something to be a language by a function. Right. Therefore, here I come. But there is an ecological language that doesn't have a function, but has a way of being. Long conversation. Very dear conversation with Wittgenstein. And now about the continental analytical thing, and get back to the question that Norman asked about Frenchness here.
Right.
And I think there's when I think of it, product here is this particular totem of modernity that is called reason or rationality. There is a kind of panic about we might not be rational. What it is to be rational. We need to be rational. We need to rationalize everything. And so on. And therefore, there are the rational guys and the rational us. And that defining us the modernization. idea of what it is, to save the world. That's the reason. So it is true here that there is a singularity in French culture. Why there is one? I have a few explanations now that suddenly I remember. In my book, La Philosophie, I actually came up with some explanations of why. It was in philosophy that interested in the question of rationality, in the question of modernity, or in the question of Aufklärung, the Lumière. Of course they were. Of course, the Lumière, as we know for Foucault, it was a second rational. But it's clear that maybe they had a larger understanding of what it is to be rational, particularly with relation to relativism. It's interesting to see that France was more welcoming to why? Maybe because the French Republic is so universalist. French intellectuals were more symbolic benefits in criticizing, whereas the Germans, Habermas, for example, the Germans, of course, were reacting to, whereas we were reacting to the colonial power, and the colonial power was the universalist power, and the US, they were simply continuing the power, the imperialist power. So of course we were not in the same position here, and so that's one of the explanations of it. And here, I think there is kind of comparative anthropology to be made of the different forms of rationality in the different countries. Anthropology of the different perceptions of reason within the European countries. And the last explanation I would give is linked to institutions. Because French academia is a weak institution. It has always been a weak institution. That's very different from German academia or US academia, British academia, or maybe also. So models of academia that were imported, that were at the heart of that particular academia. You must remember that when England, United States, later, but also Germany created the United States. In France, it was Napoleon, and the new university. They were the group. And so it's a form of training that's very particular. And I think terrible thing for us sometimes, but it's good that we take ourselves so seriously. We know that we are actually underpaid, ridiculously despised creatures in the world. So we don't take ourselves so seriously. When you are an American academic, gosh, well, you are professor. When you are a French professor, and that was true at the time with Bergson. So those two explanations, the political explanation in relation to colonization and the institutional maybe explains why there is this form of pure rationalist element in the French culture. That's my guess. Some more. Yes.
Well, we've gone way over time, but I've written a few impressions here, and I thank Professor Nythamar for mentioning and using this term of ambassador. I would prefer the term of foreign agent or spy. So these could be some impressions of a foreign agent working with structuralism. But Patrice, now, of course, avoid the formalities. It's been really a pleasure to listen to you and to discuss, and to look forward to continuing the discussion now and this evening. So, well, we can immediately see how being Saussurian in philosophy is indeed being several things, and indeed on different time scales. Some 20 years ago, you published a number of important studies on French thought in the English language, and in these very commendable essays, he would emphasize how one of the major focal points of conversion of the French structuralist scholars within philosophy was the underlying notion of being displaced. Now, although not limited to Saussure, this concept of being seems to me to work in an incisive way by which to start considering the question of being Saussurian. As considered philosophically, every term of the title of our workshop is relevant, and I would suggest that, and I think we can observe that the words give as much attention, or the words we have given as much attention to are indeed being as well as Saussurian, right? So in your 2012 critical assessment of the known periodical Cahiers pour l'analyse, you express your sympathy with the view of structuralism, especially one that conceives of a theory of subject in the form of a being displaced. As you say, I quote you here, insofar as it is a term that only exists as a form of an impossibility of coinciding with itself. I think this is a powerful idea and a subtle way of taking on the level of the non-apparent, to which contemporary French philosophy has largely devoted itself when faced with the myriad discoveries and innovations stemming from the social sciences. However, you yourself aim to displace that structuralism, shifting the original Saussurian context towards an extended one, which in fact transforms even the philosophical structuralism, at least that of the 60s. So I would say that no doubt displacement and movement and decentering or duolateral or bilateral or perhaps even crystallized theoretical gestures are clear motifs in the way you seem to set up the notion of the Saussurian sign from the Saussurian lesson. And given that you also claim that sign is another name of being, what for our colleagues in linguistics, I was ready to characterize as coming into the there through an experience of time that delimits what a world appears to be. I would infer that being displaced would then be especially open to a shift from displacement to perhaps even replacement. And as structuralism moves in thought through concatenation, I would thus add the proposal to continue the restatement toward an idea of being as replaced. So I believe we can capture at least partially the sense of the French, of the phrase in French, when we say l'aide, c'est remettre, but at the same time, replaced. It's not only putting back into the same place, it's actually taking the place of what was in that place, and in fact redefining the space. In terms of a theory of subject, I think it would lead us to founding a notion of self as indeed what we heard previously as outside of oneself. It's that which is out of oneself or outside oneself. So replace, being as replacement, would evoke another space, and it would slip into another place. And indeed, we've mentioned romantic contexts, contexts of encounter. Brings to mind a tune, a composition by the American jazz composer Henry Threadgill called My Rock, where singing along the knotted curves of a saxophone filtering tone, he observes, or the singer at least observes in the song, you're in another world in which you passed yourself on the way. So another world in which we have slipped into is one in which, once again, Saussure is the marker of a shift. Just that this time, to follow the implications of your insight, I think it truly is a break. And as you state, Saussure is the only thinker to have used the expression ontology of the sign. It's made us reflect quite a lot over the past couple of days. Quite remarkably, you reach your conclusion by evoking, if I'm not mistaken, from one of your online lectures, from reading or from an act of reading the CLG from its ending, an act of an inverted and thus experimental thinking strategy I recognize well for having tried to use it myself for a philosopher who lends himself quite amazingly to the task, because we don't have, unfortunately, that much time, to the task, who is Alain Badiou. In a recent study of mine, not yet published, I invert being an event, symmetry of which, as I contend, through the unnamed dynamic capturing its argument on a generic entity, which due to some long-lost attachment to Sartre, only he would perhaps still call subject. Of course, from the basis of the intrinsic domain of the ontology demonstrated in being an event, subject is not a subject, but a process that you terms as a generic truth procedure spread about, as you mentioned, the conditions, that is, 4 distinct fields that make up at least that part of his philosophical enterprise. Once we lift the obligation on using subject as an intrinsic designator for their procedure, these truth procedures in conditions or as conditions, I've been very interested in and attracted to the idea that we encounter none other than genericity in its Chomskyan sense as well. Now, if I follow these 2 thoughts as replacing the original mark with that of the ontology of signs, according to its own logic, a circulation between its polar components of signifier and signified, which I recall are not themselves signs, we encounter the type of realization that perhaps structuralism is most attuned to think through. Conceived from this vantage point, this sign concept is then activated in philosophical thought to function as an independent operator in relation to which the semi-autonomous entity we can call, and I call it a rational theory, depends, if it does not exist in and of itself. At best, the ontology of signs informs us from the vantage point of the unapparent, of the compositional dynamic by which theories become value-embedded things, truth things, perhaps. As such, I would put forth the suggestion that, in fact, theories precede ontologies. Ontologies perhaps emerge from theories. Now, of course, I'm saying that theories would be things out there, somewhat the way you're saying that signs are, but just to continue with this thought, theory seems to appear downstream from Saussure in a triangular graph, a triangle itself binding Badiou and Chomsky into connection with Saussure. From being Saussurian in philosophy, we may recognize the operation that places the sign into a flow. In relation to this movement, surely meaning and understanding are the goal, despite how the flow itself, as constant as the inner voice we appear to hear from within our ears, persists and subsists beyond capture and at times beyond reason itself. So being Saussurian in philosophy, this evokes a triple posture from which it seems to me a wealth of discovery awaits, no doubt inventions as well, perhaps some form of creation. It seems to me that being Saussurian evokes, strangely, you put the term as danger, I put the term as risk, surrender or abandon, and protection. I'll explain these impressions. It evokes risk, since the process of organizing the study of theories involves an attempt at creating one's own through a perspective whose goal is collective joy. It seems that looking at my text, at times I would see the same words circulating in different positions and sentences, but indeed, there's a lot of echo effect happening here. Feedback, of course, one of the great concepts of structuralism before, or let's say one that did not name itself as such. Yet creation is a dissolution as well, not primarily of self, but of the theoretical orientation, since the very premise of the Saussurian approach is transformative, as you have well pointed out, in fact, radically transformative, as you've all also made a question of pointing out. It is a dissolution and a dissipation, for no method or methodology is shielded from the transformation it bears from within. Structuralism, as one can perceive from the vantage point of displacement and replacement, is an approach that tends not to keep its name, at least in philosophy. And this is one of the reasons why structuralism goes unrecognized as the active dynamic to theory formation. It seemed to suggest as much when evoked in 2010, how structuralism is the misrecognized matrix, I cite you here, matrix to post-war French philosophy up to the end of the last century, a matrix realized in a divergent constellation of philosophical problems raised by the introduction of structural methods in the social sciences. Quote. Structuralism is thus a risk since it seeks not to convert value to price, that is, to commodify, nor primarily to colonize, if by colonize we recall Aimé Césaire's self-professed equation, coloniser, c'est chosifier. To colonize is to make into a thing. It is the risk of a sense of accumulation deviating from conversion, translation, or transformation into monetary value. Structuralism is an anti-brand as far as methodology is concerned, and an anti-patent for as far as how the market capitalizes on the education and research apparatus it compels the liberal state to make available for the training of actants before they grow into actors. Being Saussurian also evokes then surrender or abandonment, let's say. Structuralism, at least as practiced in the human social sciences, the transformation of the first into second, of which it is surely also one of the prime motivators, arises as the acceptance that it has no object. In fact, it arises from an instinctual intuition that were it to objectify, quantify, or unify, it would simply annihilate itself. George Cantor evoked such an experience at the rational level as the intuition of the mannigfaltigkeit, multiplicity or manifold, which would later be axiomatized as the theory of sets. Not to dismay, but herein lies a clear and subsistent point of entry into the nexus of difference, as far as I'm concerned. And although such difference, it is true, often seems to be at odds at plurality, its persistence and ability to subdivide internally as well as to replicate from this subdivision seems to offer a great field of promising research still to be encountered. But difference nonetheless, if we reject reducing, but it is difference nonetheless, if we reject reducing an element of a set to a fixed unit. I mean, this would be the condition, not to reduce an element of a set to a fixed unit, but perceive it as a concatenated, perceive it through intuition, as a concatenated immanence. But that's the bright side of the picture. Far beyond subject and object, nature and culture, from an anthropological point of view, what exists is difference between interiorities and physicalities. And where and whence these relations come to existence, and indeed how they differ, may relate to plurality. But what makes them differ, it seems to me, is something evoked also here, genericity. An automatic force within space that replaces and displaces along all axes. Surrendering to such a thought seems to confer a differential experience and a differential logic from whose nexus structuralism emerges as a general ontology. Such letting go evokes the encounter of triangulations, the trace of displacing and replacing along shifting axes and bidirectionality back rather than forth and back and forth, as the friction much transformation requires in order to become a place. This is why structuralism, or being Saussurian, is inherently protective also. And this is my third point, for one needs to protect the different in thought, theory, and the practice of emergence or their emergence from attempted reductions. In fact, difference only emerges, and an emergence is compelled to disappear from the drive to reduce, to justify, to qualify as much as to quantify as much as qualify, and some to make apparent. One needs to protect differentialities. I like this term a lot, very influential in Brazil, americanidade, and the renewal. We have to protect this term, the expression of what it expresses, americanidade, faced with the renewal of white supremacy. It's the term and an insistence that once Lelia Gonzalez and more recently Gerald Horne, African-American historian, put it. Indeed, it is to protect the sign itself as an ontology of the sign. And if structuralism admits to the instability of form when an analytic strategy approaches the generic core of recursivity and extension, by risk and surrender, protection may end up being the fundamental ethical disposition involved in philosophical activity itself. After all, as Plato taught us, and I'm discovering a Platonist in front of my eyes, as Plato taught us, the end of ethics is the good, while the good is also the beautiful and the true. As for the impact of the event of being Saussurian, we could focus on two of its determinations, one regarding the generative and the other the principle of non-contradiction, embedding the principle of identity. It is possible to speak of ontology without the, is it possible to speak of ontology without the universal basis of non-contradiction? This is a true question, and the Wittgensteinian reference is certainly apropos. While it is possible to defend that modes of existence are modes of speaking, the only way we might agree that they are the same as modes of existence depends on the intrinsic movement of non-contradiction. Otherwise, we would not be able to recognize them as modes of existence, it seems to me. Now, while much has been criticized about how Alain Badiou aimed to turn the idea of set theoretic foundation to ontology in being an event, specifically, volume 1, even as a pulsational process, seems to be captured within the historical inductive evidence of generic subjectivity. What I celebrate or consider to be one of his great accomplishments seems to most displease general readers of his enterprise, because it seems to me that generic subjectivity accepts the constraint of non-contradiction as the very presupposition required for a transformation so radical to occur that it might be termed as a formalized inhumanism. I would like to suggest that the principle of non-contradiction is what makes our science of theory formations and theory flow and extensions intrinsically philosophical. What makes it extra philosophical is materialized composition. But where and how we find a break with ontology, where we encounter the basis of displacement and replacement, is from without, from the place it is not. And ontology for Badiou, at least that's what he has taught us, emerges from without. What he calls the theory of multiplicities, which is the mathematical and the logical theory of sets, in his view. But it is from without. And it is a place where ontology meets operational recursivity, a computational operation carried out by Kant's genetic endowment, what Chomskyans of late have been led to call merge, and transliterate, strangely enough, due to the decades of Okay, it's
But Norma,
continued on its own.
one question